Welcome back to Midnight Outcry, everyone, and good evening. 10 of the most horrifying, true Alaskan horror stories ever recounted will take us deep into the state's freezing tundra tonight. These stories are from villagers, hunters, hikers, and bush pilots who experienced something in that harsh environment that permanently altered their lives. Every story is a terrifying nightmare taken directly from America's last frontier, where darkness reigns for months and civilization seems like a faraway memory. These stories range from the insane behavior of the butcher baker who stalked women like game animals to unexplained disappearances in the limitless tundra. These are authentic stories that will make you wonder what really exists in the Alaskan wilderness, not urban mythology or folklore. We are interested in hearing about any unexplained experiences you may have had in Alaska or any other isolated area, as your tale may help others identify the warning signs of real danger. For daily, real horror content that reveals the most sinister facets of reality, if you're new here, be sure to subscribe to Midnight Outcry. To ensure you don't miss any of the stories we unearth that others are too scared to share, click the notification bell. Let's now enter Alaska's cold wastes, where some horrors never see the light of day again and where predators other than nature exist. The concept of the last frontier captivated me, as it did many others who grew up hearing about Alaska in the 1970s and 1980s. It appeared to be an area where savage individualists could forge their own path, where there was an open and wild wilderness, and where one could blend in with the surroundings and become whoever they desired to be. Alaska was a place of adventure and independence for most people. However, as anyone who has researched Alaska's darker past is aware, the same seclusion and privacy that drew dreamers also made it an ideal place for predators to hunt. For some, the wide wilderness that held the promise of freedom turned into a place where people were killed. Additionally, Alaska was extremely dangerous for individuals who fell into the wrong hands due to its remoteness, which was part of its allure. During this time, some extremely unsettling crimes occurred in Alaska, where the criminals preyed on the state's small population and scant law enforcement resources, going years without being caught. Furthermore, Robert Hansen appeared to be the most typical person you could think of. He operated the Hansen Bakery in downtown Anchorage and was a quiet baker. A quiet family man who lived in a modest home in a middle-class area with his wife and 2 children. His heavy glasses, thinning hair, and ordinary appearance allowed him to fit in with any crowd. He was simply the man who created his clients, wedding cakes, and morning pastries. He seemed almost painfully bashful among women and stammered when he spoke. What are you aware of? One of the most vicious serial killers in American history was this seemingly innocuous baker, and his own hunting preserve was Alaska's wilderness. I believe Hansen's upbringing as an outsider helped. Because of his stutter, his severe acne, and his poor social skills, he had been cruelly teased at school. Teenagers had made his adolescence a living hell by calling him derogatory names and excluding him from social groups. However, he had taken comfort in 2 pursuits that would ultimately play a key role in his murders. He was a skilled shooter and seasoned hunter who was intimately familiar with the Alaskan landscape. His proficiency with a rifle was legendary among local hunters, and he was able to follow wildlife through even the most distant locations. One victim, a 17-year-old girl I'll call Cindy, made it through Hansen's perverse game. One evening in June 1983, Hansen contacted her while she was performing exotic dances at a bar downtown. He appeared to be more reserved and courteous than the typical patrons. She also accepted his offer to pay him for her private time at his home. She almost lost her life as a result of that choice, which would follow her for decades. While his wife and kids were visiting family in the lower 48, Hansen brought Cindy to his house in the Muldoon area. The house was simple but clean, with hunting trophies and pictures of Hansen holding different kills, mounted deer heads gazing down from the walls, and glass cases showcasing his vast hunting rifle collection. As he poured her a glass, Cindy saw that his hands were shaking and that his stutter was more noticeable than normal. Although she had previously been around anxious guys and initially did not give it much thought, Hansen had not taken her there for the reasons she had anticipated. When she had finished her drink, he produced a pair of shackles and announced that they were going to play a game in his stuttering, halting voice. Hansen took a hunting knife from his collection and put it to Cindy's throat when she resisted and attempted to get away. In that instant, his entire manner transformed. The timid, stuttering baker vanished, to be replaced by a calculating, icy figure. She learned the full horror of Hansen's actions when he brought her to his basement and put handcuffs on her wrists. Stuff belonging to other women cluttered the basement, which served as a makeshift jail. Handbags, jewelry, clothing, and photos of Hansen's victims were among the items found. Cindy became increasingly horrified upon realizing that she was viewing proof of several murders, as some of the photographs depicted women in varying states of fright and misery. Hansen informed her that she would die in a matter-of-fact manner. She would have the opportunity to run for her life during their brief excursion into the forest. In the informal style of someone recounting a weekend fishing excursion, Hansen described his perverse game. In his tiny plane, he would take his victims to a far-off place, give them a head start, and then pursue them like untamed animals. He informed her that he had mastered the method and had been doing this for years. Because there was nowhere to flee in the vast Alaskan wilderness, the women were never able to escape, and they would perish from exposure or famine even if they managed to get away from him. He declared it was the ultimate hunt, the final demonstration of his dominance over those who had rejected and derided him. Hansen put Cindy in his car the following morning and drove to Merrill Field, where he kept his Piper Super Cub. She could walk but not run because she was still in handcuffs and had a chain around her ankles. Whistling softly and examining the engine with the same attention to detail that he gave to his baking, Hansen appeared almost happy as he prepped the aircraft. He shared some of his past hunts with Cindy, explaining in detail how long each woman had lasted and how he eventually found them. All of them had finally succumbed to his gun, despite their best efforts to hide and defend themselves. Hansen described the terrain below and pointed out landmarks as they flew over the vast tundra south of Anchorage. He was familiar with all the valleys, creeks, and potential hiding places where someone in need might seek refuge. He had been hunting here for decades and had gathered weapons and supplies all across the area. He told her there was no way out. He might, however, hasten and be benevolent in her death if she offered fine sport. In a location so isolated that no one would hear her cries or discover her body for years, if at all, Hansen landed the aircraft on a sandbar next to the Nick River. He gave her a 3-inch survival knife after unchaining her ankles while leaving her handcuffs on her wrists. He assured her that she would have a 30 INUT advantage. The hunt would then start. He would let her live if she could avoid him until dusk. However, they were both aware that this was untrue. Hansen had no intention of altering his impeccable record, and no one had ever survived that long. Cindy's tied wrist made it difficult for her to keep her balance as she sprinted through the thick vegetation along the riverbed. Behind her, she could hear Hansen gathering his hunting supplies and getting his rifle ready. While the branches tore at her flesh and clothing and her wrists hurt, she forced herself to go faster as the sound of him loading the weapon sent a surge of sheer horror through her body. However, Hansen had not relied on Cindy's knowledge of wilderness survival, having grown up in Alaska. Rather than scurrying aimlessly through the forest, she headed back toward the river and discovered a precipitous embankment where she could conceal herself while still keeping an eye on Hansen's activities. She observed as he started to follow her into the forest, doing it with the smoothness of a seasoned hunter. He stalked through the trees in silence, stopping now and then to inspect splintered branches or tracks in the soft ground. Cindy stayed out of sight for hours as Hansen looked around his aircraft. She saw that he appeared more and more irritated and frustrated as the afternoon went on. His confidence was starting to falter, and this was not going as planned for him. Cindy took the initiative when Hansen eventually went back to the plane to get more supplies. She spotted Hansen's backup radio after slinking out of her hiding spot and heading to the airplane. She turned the device on and started sending a distress signal on the emergency frequency in spite of the shackles. She was so scared and tired that her voice sounded raspy. But before Hansen came back and found out what she had done, she was able to describe her kidnapper and provide an approximate location. When Hansen discovered Cindy by his plane, he became furious. Screaming that she had wrecked everything, he repeatedly hit her with the butt of his rifle. He would now need to swiftly kill her and get rid of the evidence because his well-planned quest had been jeopardized, but the harm had already been done. Cindy's signal was picked up by a bush pilot flying nearby, who immediately radioed for assistance. Search planes and state troopers from Alaska were searching the region where Cindy had aired within hours. Hansen knew that his years of killing without being noticed were coming to an end, and that his ideal hunting area had been revealed. He tried to fly away after securing Cindy again, but the police were quickly catching up with him. Police were waiting for him when he landed at a distant airport. The extent of Hansen's misdeeds was made clear by the subsequent investigation. Over the course of more than 10 years, he had murdered at least 17 women, though detectives think the real number was far higher. The majority of his victims were exotic dancers and sex workers who would not be instantly missed. Women whose disappearances were frequently explained away as the result of their ephemeral lifestyle rather than malicious intent. Hansen had meticulously documented his hunts, including images of his victims, last moments and maps showing the sites where he had slain them. A gruesome assortment of trophies he had preserved as mementos of his successful hunts, which had been stolen from the women, was discovered at his home. The full scope of his sadistic nature was exposed by the torture devices, shackles, and restraints used in the basement prison where he had imprisoned his victims. The most horrifying thing about the Hansen case was how long he had been operating undetected in his community's direct line of sight. He was a calm, helpful man who gave them fresh bread from his bakery and shoveled their driveways in the winter, according to his neighbors. He was perceived by his clients as a kind, albeit reserved proprietor who remembered their names and their preferred pastries. The monster who lived under their house was unknown even to his own family. After being found guilty on several murder charges, Hansen was given a life sentence without the chance of release. The locations of victims whose bodies were never found, and details of crimes that may never be fully comprehended, were taken with him when he passed away in captivity in 2014. However, the relatives of his victims and the knowledge that proof of his decades-long murdering rampage is still hidden in Alaska's vast wilderness bear witness to his legacy. The case altered Alaskan law enforcement's methodology for investigating missing persons, especially when it comes to vulnerable groups. It also acted as a sobering reminder that the very seclusion and privacy that draw many people to Alaska often serve as a haven for those with the most sinister motives. Some disappearances at a place where individuals go to vanish are not voluntary. And for those unfortunate enough to stumble upon a predator like Robert Hansen, the forest that offers freedom can turn into a huge, unmarked tomb. For Cindy, surviving Hansen's hunt was just the start of a protracted healing process. She struggled with survivors, guilt over the less fortunate women, and the trauma of her experience, spending years in treatment. By exposing Hansen's atrocities and putting a stop to his reign of terror in the Alaskan wilderness, her bravery in retaliating and her quick thinking in exploiting his radio ultimately saved not only her own life, but perhaps possibly the lives of other victims. The prospect of untamed nature and the ultimate test of his outdoor prowess drew Brian Harper to Alaska, as did many other aspirational hikers in their early 20s. He had spent his summers trekking across the Rockies and his weekends climbing 14 ears while growing up in Colorado. However, Alaska stood for something very different. It was more than difficult terrain and bad weather. There, civilization vanished entirely, and one could go hundreds of miles without encountering another person. Brian and other outdoor enthusiasts saw Alaska as the ultimate frontier where they could test their mettle against the harshest, most brutal nature. Anyone who has been in the backcountry of Alaska for any length of time understands that the wilderness there is more than just a challenge. It makes a conscious effort to murder you. Furthermore, In areas so large and inhospitable that search attempts are pointless, even seasoned outdoor enthusiasts can vanish completely. Over the years, Alaska has seen a number of extremely bizarre disappearances, with seasoned hunters and hikers disappearing in places they were familiar with. Just strewn about equipment and unsolved concerns remain. People are swallowed whole in the wilderness, and any traces of their whereabouts are swiftly erased by the hostile environment and scavenger animals. Furthermore, Brian gave off the impression that he was the type of person who would defeat Alaska rather than allow it to defeat him. He was in the best physical shape of his life, 24 years old and 6 feet 2. For months, he had been preparing for this journey by running ultra-marathons and hiking through the Colorado Rockies with a weighted pack to get ready for the difficulties that lay ahead. He was meticulous in his preparation, meticulous about his equipment, and sure of his ability to manage whatever challenge Alaska would present. I believe it was beneficial that Brian was well liked by the Anchorage outdoor community. Before his intended solo journey, he had spent 2 weeks in the city, visiting gear stores, speaking with park rangers, and making connections with seasoned Alaskan hikers who could advise him on the conditions in the Chugach National Forest. His readiness and his realistic evaluation of the hazards were impressive to everyone he met. He was a genuine mountaineer who knew the risks and knew how to reduce them, not just a tourist searching for Instagram pictures. One of the people Brian met while in Anchorage was Marcus, a local hiking guide who worked at a downtown gear store. With more than 15 years of experience leading expeditions in Alaska, Marcus had witnessed innumerable tourists undervalue the outdoors and suffer the consequences of their arrogance. Brian, however, was unique. Later, Marcus informed investigators. Even seasoned guides were astonished by his thorough knowledge of wilderness safety procedures, his ability to purchase the appropriate gear, and his insightful inquiries. Brian and Marcus talked about weather patterns, potential risks, and trail conditions while studying topographic maps of the Chugach National Forest for hours. He organized a 10-day solo track through some of the forest's most isolated regions, starting on well-traveled paths and then veering off into unmarked wilderness to hone his navigational abilities and experience actual isolation. They talked about what to do in the event that Brian came into wildlife or bad weather, and Marcus assisted him in organizing resupply caches and emergency plans. Though not reckless, Brian's path was ambitious. Beginning at the Crow Pass trailhead, he would travel roughly 20 meters south on the old Iditarod Trail before heading east into the Turnagain Arm region. From there, he intended to explore isolated valleys that received maybe a dozen tourists annually and ascend a number of unidentified summits. The terrain was difficult and called for highly skilled mountaineering. However, Brian was well prepared for the extra difficulties presented by Alaska's erratic weather and wildlife, having proven his mettle on comparable terrain in Colorado. In late August, when the weather was still largely consistent but the tourist hordes had subsided, Brian set out on a clear morning. 10 days, supply of food, a top-notch four-season tent, and emergency supplies, including a satellite communicator that would enable him to call for assistance if needed, were all packed inside a 60-pound pack. He intended to use the device to check in with Marcus every 2 days. Marcus would also notify the authorities and give them Brian's schedule in detail if he didn't get in touch. For the first 4 days, everything proceeded as planned. In his succinct but ebullient communications, Brian reported fantastic weather, superb trail conditions, and breathtaking scenery. He had arrived at his designated camping locations on time and appeared to be relishing the challenge and solitude of traversing some of Alaska's most pristine terrain. He was on the verge of departing the established trail system and entering unmarked country where satellite coverage would be patchy, according to his last message, which was transmitted on the evening of August 28th. Marcus wasn't worried right away when Brian didn't check in on August 30th. Mountainous topography may make satellite connectivity unstable, and Brian may just be in an area where he is unable to receive a strong signal. Marcus, however, called the Alaska State Troopers and reported Brian as overdue when another day went by without hearing from him. Within hours, a search and rescue effort was underway, with teams of seasoned volunteers combing over Brian's intended path alongside park rangers and state troopers. With helicopter overflights, ground teams with tracking dogs, and cooperation with bush pilots who were familiar with the area, the search effort was enormous by Alaskan standards. However, the Chugach National Forest encompasses more than 5 million acres of some of North America's roughest landscapes. And it's like trying to find a needle in a haystack to find one individual in that huge wilderness. For the first few days, the searchers tracked Brian's path, establishing that he had adhered to his prearranged schedule and discovering signs of his campsites. However, he was not to be found after his last verified whereabouts. About 15 miles from Brian's last known location, on September 5th, a helicopter crew noticed something strange next to a secluded creek. Pieces of his backpack appeared to have been ripped apart and tossed all over a tiny clearing. In an attempt to gather information regarding Brian's whereabouts, the searchers descended from the helicopter and started gathering the wreckage. What they discovered was quite unsettling. There seemed to have been a great deal of force behind the destruction of Brian's pack. The thick nylon cloth was ripped into strips and strewn all over the place. Someone had torn open his sleeping bag after removing it from the pack. Like snow, the artificial insulation covered the earth. Food containers had been smashed and their contents removed. The blood that was heavily seeped into the ground surrounding the debris field was the most disturbing of all. Much more blood than might result from small wounds. In order to find any evidence that could help explain what had happened, the search teams meticulously inspected the area. Massive paw prints that were larger than any known creature footprints in the area were discovered in the soft ground near the creek. Though bear-like, the size of the prints suggested that the animal was far larger than even the largest brown bears that are usually found in Alaska. Clear claw marks that had carved deep furrows in the earth were visible in some of the prints. However, there were additional tunes, prints that were difficult to classify. Some were extended, with claw marks at the tips of what should have been toes, and they looked like they were from bare human feet. The depth of the imprints implied extraordinary weight and power, and the stride length suggested something far taller than a typical person. The most unsettling aspect was that the big paw prints and the human-like tracks appeared to be following the same route, as though two distinct animals had been cooperating. Brian's rifle, a strong lever-action 3030 that he had carried for bear protection, was also discovered by the searchers. With 2 spent cartridges laying nearby, the weapon had just been fired, yet it was bent and twisted as though it had been crushed like a tin can by something of immense strength. The barrel was actually bent at a 90 degrees angle, and the stock was shattered, harm that could only be caused by thousands of pounds of force. More unsettling information surfaced as the investigation went on. Around the time Brian vanished, local bush pilots reported seeing weird lights in the region. The woodland canopy was lighted by bright flashes that lacked a clear source. Nearby towns of native Alaskans tell tales of monsters they named the Tornaruk, enormous animals that hunted in the deepest woods and were a mix of bear and man. Legend has it that the Tornaruk could imitate human speech and would lure wayward visitors farther into the forest, where they would never be heard again. Teams searched every valley and mountain within 50 miles of where Brian's equipment was discovered during the 2-week official search for him. A few other bits of his equipment, such as his water bottles and compass, were found strewn across a large region, but nothing that could be used to determine his destiny. There was insufficient blood evidence for more thorough DNA testing, but it was sent to labs for investigation and was found to be human and to match Brian's blood type. Long after the official operation was canceled, Marcus continued to coordinate private search operations. He felt guilty about Brian's disappearance and kept thinking that there might have been locations that had not been thoroughly examined or hints he had overlooked. He gathered volunteer teams to investigate remote locations that the official searchers had not yet reached, and used his own funds to hire bush pilots to conduct aerial inspections. Marcus' crew was horrified by what they discovered during one of these covert searches. About 20 miles from where Brian's equipment was located, They came to what looked to be a crude shelter, made of animal hides, moss, and branches in a series of caves. Numerous bones, including what forensic experts subsequently determined to be the remains of several people, were found inside the shelter. While some of the bones had been broken open as though to remove the marrow, others displayed obvious bite marks from enormous teeth. Personal belongings of other hikers who went missing were also found in the cave. Individuals who had vanished in Alaska in recent years. Pieces of hiking boots, camping gear, and even a wallet with identification belonging to a guy who had disappeared 3 years prior were found. It seems as though whatever beast was causing these disappearances used the cave as a feeding den or trophy chamber. The searchers discovered indications that the cave had been occupied recently, which is perhaps the most frightening of all. Fresh kills hung from the ceiling, animal carcasses in varying states of decay, and what seemed like sleeping quarters were surrounded by more modern clothes and equipment. Whatever inhabited the cave was still alive and well, seeking and taking victims from those who dared or dared not journey into Alaska's most remote wilderness. Although Brian's disappearance has never been officially explained, the investigation into his disappearance is still ongoing. The evidence points to an encounter with something much more hazardous than the wolves, bears, and severe weather that Alaskan hikers usually face. In the region where Brian disappeared, local officials subtly discourage solo trekking, and seasoned guides now caution their clients about the dangers of going too deep into unmarked territory. For Marcus and the other outdoor community members who knew Brian, his disappearance is a stark reminder that there are still mysteries in Alaska that cannot be explained. The forest that draws adventurers with its promise of isolation and difficulty might also be home to predators that are beyond our current comprehension. Creatures that see humans as prey to be sought and eaten in the bleak interior of Alaska, rather than as fellow members of the natural world. Music Chuck Carpachet's, like many bush pilots who flew hunters and fishermen into the far reaches of Alaska for a career, believed he had seen everything the wilderness has to offer. Since the early 1970s, he had been flying in Alaska, accumulating thousands of hours over some of the continent's most hazardous and unpredictable terrain. He had made it through storms that would have kept commercial planes grounded for days, landed on makeshift strips cut out of frozen tundra, and survived engine failures over uncharted territory. Alaska was more than simply a job to Chuck and other pilots. Only the most knowledgeable and experienced individuals made it through this testing ground, where mistakes were valued in terms of life and death rather than pennies. Anybody who has flown a bush plane in Alaska knows that mistakes are not forgiven in the wilderness. Furthermore, pilots who overdo it usually end up as statistics rather than legendary figures. Over the years, bush pilots have reported some extremely odd occurrences in which they claim to have seen objects in the far-flung lakes and rivers that were beyond the realm of reason. The depths of several lakes had never been measured or examined, and the vast waterways of interior Alaska were mainly uncharted and unmapped. Chuck was the type of pilot who brushed such tales aside as the result of loneliness, exhaustion, or spending too much time in the cockpit by himself. He had no sympathy for stories about monsters or otherworldly animals that lurked in Alaska's waters because he was a pragmatic man who trusted in what he could see, touch, and measure. Chuck's reputation for dependability and cool-headedness, in my opinion, benefited. When circumstances became too hazardous for other pilots to handle, other pilots would summon him. The guy who could fly through storms that kept everyone else grounded, or land a float plane on a parking lot-sized lake. He took seriously the responsibility that his clients entrusted to him with their life. During his 30 years of flying, he had never submitted a report that was not verifiable or made a claim that could not be supported by concrete proof. Nate Peterson, a fishing guide with more than 20 years of experience in the waters surrounding Lake Iliamna, was one of Chuck's frequent customers. As a fourth-generation Alaskan, Nate had grown up listening to his grandfather's tales about the lake. There are legends of enormous animals that resided in the deep and periodically came to the surface to frighten fishermen or capsize vessels. with a surface area of more than 1,000 square miles and depths that had never been precisely determined. Lake Iliamna was the biggest lake in Alaska. It was rare to recover drowning victims' bodies since the water was so cold and deep. Additionally, the lake was known to the locals as a location where odd occurrences occurred and individuals vanished for no apparent reason, with Chuck providing transportation to far-flung fishing locations and Nate guiding affluent clientele from the lower 48 who were prepared to shell out top dollar for monster salmon and trout. Because of their shared experiences and respect for one another, they had established a smooth working relationship. Additionally, Chuck appreciated Nate's familiarity with the local weather and water conditions. Despite indications of dangerous weather rolling in from the Gulf of Alaska, Chuck readily agreed to take a flight to the northern end of Lake Iliamna when Nate contacted in early September 1987. On a dreary morning with low skies and sporadic rain, they departed Anchorage in Chuck's de Havilland Beaver floatplane. Although the weather was unsuitable for flying, both men were certain they could make the journey safely because they had operated in worse conditions. Before heading back to Anchorage, they intended to spend 2 days fishing in a secluded bay on the north shore of Lake Iliamna, where Nate had been successful with late-season salmon runs. Chuck navigated through sporadic rain squalls and dispersed clouds throughout the roughly 2-hour journey to Lake Iliamna. The weather started to clear as they got closer to the lake, allowing them to glimpse the vast expanse of dark water that stretched to the horizon. Experienced pilots knew to anticipate abrupt changes in wind and visibility when flying over Lake Iliamna because of its size, which caused it to produce its own weather patterns. Chuck was as familiar with the lake's temperaments and moods as any pilot in Alaska, having made hundreds of landings there over the years. Chuck, however, observed something strange about the water conditions as they lowered themselves near their intended landing place. Despite winds that should have produced large waves, the lake's surface was abnormally calm, and the water had odd patterns that appeared to be enormous currents or other disturbances flowing just below the surface. Nate also noticed and remarked that, in his decades of fishing the lake, he had never seen it act in such a manner. Chuck carefully prepared his approach, bringing the floatplane down toward the lake's glassy surface while monitoring his altitude and airspeed. The plane settled into its taxi mode, and the floats kissed the water gently during the uneventful and flawless landing. In search of a good beaching location where they could secure the aircraft and offload their belongings, they drove toward the coast. They noticed it at that point. The surface of Lake Iliamna started to protrude upward around 200 yards off their port wing, as though something enormous were emerging from the depths. Chuck initially believed it might be a big log or other trash floating just below the surface. However, the disruption became more noticeable and bigger as they observed. They could see something substantial and dark moving beneath the water as it started to create a dome that rose several feet above the regular surface level. Nate's voice was tight with dread and excitement as he grasped Chuck's arm and pointed at the abnormality. There was something huge under the sea, perhaps even bigger than a school bus. They could hear odd noises emanating from the water, and as it moved, it produced strong currents that rocked their floatplane in spite of the distance. There were low-frequency rumbles that sounded as if they were vibrating through the hull of the airplane. Chuck turned on the engine right soon and started to taxi away from the commotion, but it appeared that whatever was underneath them was pursuing them. The water dome followed their path, remaining roughly the same distance away but obviously following them. Parts of the creature started to show through the surface as they watched in increasing alarm, giving them glimpses of something that was difficult to describe. What they observed was unlike any aquatic animal they had ever seen. The animal's back seemed to have several humps or segments. They were all about the size of a compact automobile and had skin that appeared to be covered in dark scales. They could make out parts of a huge body that appeared to gracefully undulate through the water between the humps. Most unsettling of all, they saw what they thought was a head at the creature's front, a huge triangular form with eyes that radiated a spooky phosphorescent light. For a brief instant, the creature came fully to the surface, showcasing its immense size and startling the two men into quiet. With a body as thick as a railroad car and appendages that might have been fins or legs protruding from its sides, it measured at least 60 feet in length from head to tail. With intelligent eyes, and what looked like nostrils that ejected strong jets of water vapor. The head was reptile yet oddly mammalian. The dark gray or black skin of the monster appeared to move and ripple in patterns that were painful to look at up close. The creature appearing to notice their plane, however, was the most horrifying moment. Chuck could sense intelligence in those brilliant eyes, a malignant understanding that identified them as intruders in its realm, and it turned toward them with purposeful intent. The creature started to accelerate toward them, producing a wake that resembled a big ship's bow wave more than anything made by a living animal. Chuck started his takeoff run by turning the throttles to full power. However, the float plane required time to reach a proper speed because it was heavily loaded with gear and fuel. The creature was swiftly gaining ground behind them, swimming faster than something of that size should have been able to. Nate reported that the object was only 50 yards distant and was still closing quickly while yelling instructions and keeping an eye on their pursuer. Just as the creature approached their location, Chuck yanked back on the controls and lifted the float plane into the air as it finally reached takeoff speed. It felt a terrific impact against the hull of the airplane as they lifted out of the water, a blow that made the engine stutter for a time and pushed them both into their straps. As the plane vibrated and trembled, Chuck struggled to keep control, looking for damage on his instruments while Nate looked back to see what had struck them. The beast had launched itself into the air with amazing velocity after breaching entirely out of the water in its attempt to grab their plane. For a split second, like if time had stopped, the enormous creature dangled over Lake Iliamna. Its appendages, which uncannily resembled arms or tentacles, reached for them, water dripping from its body. The creature then slammed back into the lake as gravity took over, launching a water jet that was almost as high as their plane. Chuck didn't hold back from seeing what might come next. As he pondered everything they had just gone through, his hands trembled on the controls as he rose quickly to increase distance and altitude. One of their floats had been damaged by the creature's hit, resulting in a slow leak that would make returning to the sea hazardous, if not impossible. They'd need to head back to Anchorage right now and try to reach a runway before the damaged float failed entirely. As both men tried to comprehend what they had seen, the trip back to Anchorage was quiet and anxious. Throughout his years of flying, Chuck had seen bears, moose, and even whales, but nothing like the size and apparent intellect of the creature they had come upon. Even though Nate had been on Alaskan waters for decades, he acknowledged that he had never seen anything like what had attempted to attack their plane. Chuck immediately started examining the damage to his floatplane after they made a safe landing at Anchorage Airport. He discovered something quite unsettling. There were obvious impact marks from something with a lot of force on the aluminum hull, but the damage was not accidental. Parallel gouges that resembled claw marks were present. These scratches were not the result of unintentional touch, but rather of something with intellect and purpose. Most alarming of all, they were multiple triangular things lodged in the damaged float that resembled enormous fangs that had broken off when the beast impacted their aircraft. Chuck gave a thorough written record of their experiences and reported the matter to aviation authorities, but the official response was, at best, dubious. The incident was categorized as an encounter with an unknown huge marine animal, possibly a whale or giant seal, that had been misdiagnosed due to stress and poor visibility, without any images or other witnesses. Although the aircraft's physical damage was acknowledged, it was ascribed to hit with floating debris rather than a live thing. However, Chuck and Nate were aware of what they had witnessed, and the encounter left both men forever altered. Chuck never again flew over Lake Iliamna, citing scheduling constraints or mechanical issues whenever customers asked to visit the region. Nate soon shifted his business to smaller, shallower areas where he felt safer, and he stopped leading fishing trips to the lake. Although both men were reluctant to talk about the occurrence in public, they told other pilots and guides about it in private as a warning about the potential perils that could be found beneath Alaska's isolated seas. There is still no explanation for the creature they saw in Lake Iliamna. According to native Alaskan mythology, the deepest lakes are home to enormous water spirits that are fiercely protective of their area and older than human memory. Although no concrete proof has yet been discovered, scientists have conjectured about unidentified marine reptilian species or ancient animals that may have persisted in Alaska's remote waters. The experience was a sobering reminder to Chuck and Nate that there are still secrets in Alaska that are beyond our current comprehension. They believed they knew the forest so well, but it had turned out to be full of unimaginable perils and animals that lived in the liminal areas between myth and reality. Their Lake Iliamna incident became a silent warning among Alaska's guiding and aviation communities, a caution that some mysteries are too risky to delve too deeply into, and that some waters are best left alone. Music Ashley Morrison had spent her entire life surrounded by wildlife and believed she knew the natural order of the wilderness surrounding her community of port protection, much like many others who grew up in isolated Alaskan settlements. When she was only old enough to handle a rifle, her father Marcus had taught her how to hunt and fish. And by the time she was 16, she was able to follow animals through thick woodland, find her way by the stars, and spend days in the backcountry with just a pack and her local knowledge. For bush-raised children like Ashley, Alaska was a place to be respected rather than a hostile place to be subdued. And rather than posing a threat, the local animals were neighbors. The interaction between people and animals is sensitive and complicated, based on strict boundaries and mutual understanding that have been developed over many generations of coexistence, as anybody who has spent any significant time in Southeast Alaska understands. Over the years, there had been some really odd encounters in the port protection area, with seasoned hunters reporting seeing wolf behavior that went against everything experts understood about these often predictable animals. Compared to their interior cousins, the wolves of Southeast Alaska were usually smaller and more wary, preferring to hunt in the dense forest where they could stay out of sight and avoid human contact. And Ashley was the type of person who brushed such tales aside as the result of inexperience, fear, or spending too much time in the woods by herself. Throughout her hunting adventures, she had been across wolves numerous times and had always found them to be intelligent but ultimately predictable creatures that behaved according to established patterns. The fact that Ashley's father was familiar with the local wildlife and the folklore around it, I believe, was beneficial. Marcus Morrison, a third-generation port protection resident, inherited his hunting and survival skills from his grandpa, a Tellingate senior, who had inherited traditional knowledge about the country and its people. Ashley learned from Marcus to respect wolves as apex predators and to recognize that, as long as people took the right measures and didn't encroach on pack territory or den sites, they posed little direct threat. Ashley and her father frequently went hunting with Derek Williamson, an elderly man who had retired from commercial fishing in the 1980s and relocated to port protection. Derek was in his early 60s, but he was still a skilled tracker and a great shot, as familiar with the island's topography as any longtime inhabitant. He had taken on the role of a sort of surrogate grandfather to Ashley, telling stories about his exploits in Alaska's far-flung fishing grounds and teaching her sophisticated hunting skills. For weeks, Ashley and Derek had been preparing for a deer hunt, hoping that the weather and tides would cooperate so they could reach some of the more isolated locations where the biggest bucks might be found. When circumstances finally came together in late October 2003, they made the decision to try a difficult hunt in the mountainous interior of Prince of Wales Island. This region provided the chance of trophied Sitka black-tailed deer, but required a lengthy journey through impenetrable forest. On a clear, chilly morning with temps slightly above freezing, they left before sunrise. Derek had noticed encouraging signs during a scouting trip the month before, and the goal was to travel about 8 miles inland to a series of alpine meadows. Despite the rough terrain, which included steep slopes and dense vegetation that made travel slow and taxing, both hunters were in good physical condition and self-assured enough to manage the hard circumstances. About 4 hours into their journey, they started to notice wolf tracks that appeared to be following their path, which was the first indication that something was off. Although Ashley had seen wolf footprints numerous times previously, these were unusual in a number of unsettling ways. Initially, the tracks were abnormally enormous, indicating animals far larger than the ordinary Southeast Alaska wolves she knew. Second, it appeared as though the wolves were purposefully following Ashley and Derek, as the footprints were new and obviously followed the same route. Derek took a close look at the tracks and verified Ashley's findings. In addition to being larger than usual, the animals who left these prints appeared to be moving in a pack that was far larger than the usual wolf family groups. The traces they were seeing indicated at least a dozen wolves, if not more, when most wolf groups in southeast Alaska had 4 to 6 animals. Even worse, there were no indications of the typical hunting behavior that wolves exhibited when traversing their territory in the tracks. Rather, the creatures appeared to be coordinated and moving with purpose. This implied that they were pursuing particular prey. Ashley and Derek started to feel like they were being watched as they climbed higher and higher toward the alpine meadows. Without the traditional bird cries or small animal sounds that usually accompany a walk through the woods, the surrounding forest had grown abnormally quiet. Both hunters were on edge because of the tense and anticipatory environment created by the seemingly muffled wind. They started keeping their rifles ready and watching their back trail more often, but neither of them wanted to acknowledge how anxious they had grown. They arrived at the edge of the alpine zone, where the dense forest gave way to broad meadows and sporadic timber stands, approximately 6 hours into their journey. Since it would be more difficult for predators to approach undetected on the open land, the change in topography should have given them a sense of security. Ashley felt more vulnerable and exposed than she had in the dense forest below, though. Fresh scat suggested that the pack had just passed through the area, and the wolf footprints continued across the meadow, exactly just where they had been. Derek proposed that they forgo their hunting plans and head back to the city. After hiking so far and exerting so much effort to get to their destination, Ashley was hesitant to give up. She maintained that because wolves were inherently interested in people, they might just be following their scent trail without intending to harm them. Ashley thought their worries might be exaggerated because they had both previously come into contact with wolves without any problems. Derek grudgingly consented to go on, but demanded that they stick close and keep an eye out for any danger. They saw many of deer signs, but no animals during their unsuccessful afternoon hunt in the alpine meadows. They made the decision to camp in a safe spot, close to a small creek where they could have access to fresh water and some wind protection, as nightfall drew near and the temperature started to drop. Ashley made their food as Derek started a fire. Despite the growing sense that they were not alone in the wilderness, they both tried to have a normal discussion. They started to hear sounds that made them feel cold as night fell. Distant howling, the typical vocalizations used by wolves to communicate with their packmates over great distances, was the beginning of it. Ashley, however, started to realize that the howling was not coming from a typical wolf pack as the night went on, as it became closer and more frequent. With intricate harmonies and rhythms that were almost musical in their intricacy, the vocalizations were deeper and more varied than anything she had ever heard. Derek had spent decades hunting and trapping wolves, but he had never heard the noises they were hearing. It appeared that the pack had surrounded their camp and was communicating in ways that showed advanced coordination and forethought, because the howling seemed to be coming from all directions. The most unsettling aspect was that some of the vocalizations had tones and inflections that resembled human speech patterns, making them sound uncannily human. The roaring ceased altogether after midnight, and the silence that followed was far more horrifying than the noises had been. With their weapons over their knees, Ashley and Derek sat by their fire, listening for any sign of the wolves' whereabouts or their plans. The crackling of their fire and the distant sound of the wind through the trees were the only sounds to break the seemingly endless calm. Then, from the shadows outside their camp, they started to see eyes reflecting the firelight. There were only a few pairs of glowing orbs at start. As Derek and Ashley gazed in dread, however, more and more eyes came into view until dozens of wolves watched them from the darkness, totally encircling them. The animals were calm and still, forming a circle of predators that surrounded their little camp entirely. Ashley's understanding of wolf behavior was completely contradicted by what transpired next. Instead of attacking or fleeing, the pack started to approach in a well-coordinated manner, displaying planning and intellect that was almost human in its complexity. The two hunters were hunched by their fire, while the wolves moved forward step by step, keeping their formation and maintaining eye contact with each other. Above all, Ashley was horrified to realize that these were not your typical wolves. They were enormous creatures, far bigger than any wolves she had ever seen. Derek raised his gun and fired a warning shot over the heads of the oncoming wolves, expecting them to scatter as any other pack would when faced with human hostility. His motions and intelligent eyes suggesting knowledge and purpose that went beyond natural predator behavior. The wolves did not appear to be afraid of the gunshot or the humans who had fired it. Instead, they halted their advance, but stayed in formation. They appear to be using intelligence rather than intuition to assess the circumstances and make decisions. Ashley and Derek were stranded in their camp for hours as the wolf pack kept its silent watch over them. There was a stalemate that lasted through Ashley's longest night, since the animals never attacked, but also never fled. Something equally stranger occurred as morning drew near. The pack's largest wolf, a massive creature that appeared to be the alpha leader, advanced into the firelight and came within 30 yards of their camp. Ashley had never seen an animal like it. It was larger than many black bears, standing almost 4 feet tall at the shoulder and weighing close to 200 pounds. Its eyes had a rather unnerving intelligence, and its gray and black coat appeared to move and alter in the flickering firelight. Most unsettling of all, the animals appeared to be examining them with the same meticulous scrutiny that a predatory person could employ when assessing possible prey. For some minutes, the alpha wolf gazed at Ashley and Derek. As though listening to noises they couldn't hear, its head cocked slightly. And then suddenly it reared back its head and let out a roar that neither hunter had ever heard before. Harmonics and overtones carried by the deep, resonant sound appeared to pulse into their bones and into their bodies. Answering howls from the rest of the pack shortly followed, generating a cacophony of sound that reverberated off the nearby peaks and filled the alpine valley. The wolves then vanished as abruptly as they had appeared, melting back into the shadows. Fearful to move or sleep, Ashley and Derek stayed by their fire until daybreak, but the pack never came back. They discovered traces everywhere when they eventually plucked up the bravery to look around their camp. There was no doubt that during the night they had been besieged by dozens of enormous wolves. However, there was another factor. Neither hunter ever spoke to anyone outside of their own family about it or reported it to the authorities. There were other prints mixed in with the wolf tracks. They had unsettlingly human-looking marks, but with claw marks and off-center dimensions. The depth of the impressions implied amazing weight and power, and the stride links suggested something considerably taller than a typical person. Most disturbing of all, these human-like footprints appeared to guide the wolf prints, as though something that walked upright had been coordinating the behavior of the pack and guiding its movements. Ashley and Derek abandoned their hunting plans and gear in their rush to get to civilization, packed up their tent, and climbed out of the mountains as fast as they could. They never went back to that part of Prince of Wales Island again, and both of them were hesitant to share their experience with anyone who had not lived in Alaska long enough to realize that some experiences with wildness could not be explained by traditional methods. Ashley's relationship with the Alaskan wilderness was irrevocably altered by the tragedy. Even though she kept hunting and fishing, she never again went into the isolated places where she had felt totally at home as a child. Ashley thought that Derek's faith in his ability to survive in the wilderness had been rattled by the event, but he moved away from port protection within a year of their encounter, claiming that his retirement plans had altered. When discreetly questioned about the occurrence, the local Tilling elders nodded knowingly and related old tales of wolves that were more than just wolves, beings that protected the deep wilderness and would only put up with humans to a certain extent. They believed that these spirit wolves were as intelligent as or more intelligent than humans, and that they could transform into people when needed. The elders clarified that although they were extremely protective of their domain and would not think twice about removing challenges to the natural order they had been tasked with defending, they were not evil. Ashley saw the experience as a reminder that there were still mysteries in Alaska that were beyond the realm of science. The woods she believed she knew so well had turned out to be home to protectors and guardians who followed laws and had motives that were hard to explain. She discreetly told other hunters and outdoor enthusiasts about her encounter with the ghost wolves, which turned into a warning that certain parts of Alaska were protected to a degree far beyond what any government agency could offer. Music Samuel Kowalski had been ice fishing since he was old enough to grasp a rod, and like many Alaskan locals who grew up on the frozen lakes and rivers of the interior, he had never encountered anything on the ice that really scared him. He knew the rhythms and perils of Alaska's frozen streams better than anybody in the Fairbanks area, having spent many winter days drilling holes through 3-foot thick ice while patiently waiting for northern pike and lake trout to eat his bait. For men like Samuel, who worked as wilderness outfitters and fishing guides, the ice season was not only a time for enjoyment, but also a vital source of revenue to support the summer tourism industry. The ice is a living, breathing thing that is always shifting and changing, as anyone who has spent a significant amount of time on Alaska's frozen lakes is aware. Furthermore, when conditions worsen more quickly than anyone could have predicted, even seasoned fishermen may find themselves in potentially fatal circumstances. Over the years, there have been a number of extremely perilous instances on the isolated lakes near Fairbanks, where skilled ice anglers have either vanished through thinning ice or become stuck when abrupt weather conditions make it difficult to return to shore. Extreme cold, erratic ice conditions, and the great distances involved made ice fishing in Alaska a potentially fatal activity that necessitated meticulous planning and ongoing attention to detail. Furthermore, Samuel was the type of fisherman who took every safety measure very seriously. He always carried safety gear, checked the thickness of the ice frequently, and never ventured onto dubious ice without the necessary gear and contingency plans. Samuel's grandfather, Leon, a Polish immigrant who had immigrated to Alaska in the 1940s and had taught him how to survive in the hostile interior climate by paying close attention to the environment and showing respect for it, taught him how to fish for ice, which I believe was helpful. In addition to teaching fishing methods, Leon had also imparted traditional knowledge about interpreting ice conditions, comprehending weather patterns, and spotting the warning indications that preceded hazardous circumstances. Samuel appreciated this traditional method and blended it with contemporary safety gear to develop a methodical technique to ice fishing that had protected him during several decades of winter excursions. A younger man called Tyler Hendress, who had relocated from Montana to Alaska and was keen to master the specific methods needed for effective ice fishing in the harsh circumstances of the far north, was one of Samuel's frequent fishing companions on his winter excursions. Tyler was a physically fit man in his late 20s with a wealth of knowledge about winter survival and cold weather camping. However, his lack of precise knowledge about Alaskan ice conditions could have made the difference between a tragic calamity and a good fishing excursion. About 60 miles northeast of Fairbanks, Samuel and Tyler had been organizing a big ice fishing trip to a secluded lake that was only reachable by snowmobile in the winter and provided the chance to capture trophied lake trout that were rarely subjected to fishing pressure from other anglers. Situated in a valley encircled by low mountains, the lake was nourished by several springs that prevented parts of the water from freezing entirely, providing perfect conditions for big fish that continued to be active all winter long. On a Friday morning in early February, when the temperature was only about -20 degrees Fahrenheit, they set out. Not too cold to make camping uncomfortable with the right equipment, but cold enough to guarantee solid ice conditions. They intended to camp in a heated ice shelter that Samuel had used effectively on earlier excursions and fish on the lake during the day for 3 days. In case the weather did not allow them to return on Sunday evening, they had enough food and gasoline for a week. With frozen swamps, high ridges, and multiple stream crossings where the ice conditions needed to be carefully assessed before continuing, the 60-mile snowmobile journey to the lake took almost 3 hours. Tyler followed on a smaller snowmobile, but Samuel led the way on his formidable Arctic Cat. They were both towing cargo sleds filled with emergency supplies, camping gear, and fishing gear. There was no breeze and the weather was clear and freezing. Ideal circumstances for their intended journey. Everything appeared just as Samuel had anticipated from his prior visits to the area when they arrived at the lake in the early afternoon. There were no visible indications of pressure ridges or other hazardous features that would point to unstable ice, and the lake was entirely covered with snow-covered ice that seemed thick and solid. By drilling multiple test holes around their intended fishing spot with his ice auger, Samuel was able to verify that the ice was over 30 inches thick and completely safe for their operations. They set up camp and drilled fishing holes in promising spots around the lake for the rest of Friday. Their ice shelter was an advanced, well-insulated building that could accommodate soldiers and their gear in comfort, while shielding them from the cold and wind. In order to keep the indoor temperature well above freezing even when the outside temperature fell to dangerously low levels throughout the night, Samuel had installed a tiny gas heater. It was a clear and bitterly cold Saturday morning, with Samuel estimating the temperature to be roughly minus 30 degrees. In order to capitalize on the early morning hours when lake trout were most likely to be actively feeding, they started fishing before daybreak. During the first few hours of daylight, both men caught a number of nice fish, demonstrating the exceptional fishing conditions. The caliber of the fishing and the success of Samuel's methods for drawing fish in the bitterly cold weather astounded Tyler. However, Samuel started to observe little alterations in the ice conditions at noon, which caused him to become more anxious. Hairline fractures that appeared to radiate outward from some of their fishing holes were starting to appear on the solid, uniform surface they had been fishing on. Even more unsettling were the sporadic popping and moaning noises Samuel could hear emanating from deep below the ice. Noises that suggested the ice surface was unstable and under stress. Samuel identified these warning indications as signs that the ice was starting to shift and weaken because of changes in temperature, water level, or underwater currents, but Tyler did not first appreciate their significance. He had been in such circumstances before and was aware that they might quickly worsen from being just worrisome to being immediately fatal. Samuel proposed that they pack everything and return to Fairbanks. However, after spending so much time and traveling so far, Tyler was hesitant to call off their fruitful fishing trip. Samuel consented to fish for an additional hour while keeping a close eye on the situation. But his worries were justified. They heard the sound that all ice fishermen fear at about 2 o'clock. The ice's sharp crack as it starts to split under strain. It sounded as though it originated beneath their feet. There was a deep rumbling that implied the frozen lake was being influenced by enormous powers. Samuel gave Tyler the command to quickly assemble their necessary equipment and be ready to leave their fishing place. However, things worsened more quickly than either guy had expected when they started packing their gear. The tiny flaws they had previously observed abruptly grew into noticeable cracks. It started moving in all directions across the ice surface. Minutes before, the ice had been safe and solid, but now it was a perilous tangle of moving plates and unstable areas that could suddenly fall. Most horrifying of all, a huge fissure had formed between their position and the lake's edge, blocking their path back to shore. When Tyler realized they were stuck on a piece of ice that was getting more unstable by the minute, he started to panic. Samuel could see that the surface beneath their ice shelter was shifting and settling, and that the groaning and popping sounds coming from below them were becoming louder and more regular. They parked their snowmobiles, their only way out of the isolated lake, on ice that was now clearly rising and falling with the flow of the water below. Samuel compelled himself to maintain composure and methodically consider their choices. The main fissure that separated them from the coast was too large for them to jump across, and the edges were too shaky to hold a bridge or make a temporary crossing. Although their patch of ice remained solid and rather thick, it was obviously drifting away from the main ice sheet and might break away entirely at any time. They would be stuck on a floating ice island, with no means of getting to safety if that occurred. As day turned to nightfall, the temperature started to drop, and Samuel realized they had just a few hours of daylight remaining to find a solution before they were stranded on shaky ice in freezing temperatures. Because of the moving ice beneath it, their ice shelter was no longer safe to use. It was tilting at a perilous angle that could collapse if the ice moved any farther. Samuel had to make the painful choice to leave behind the majority of their equipment and try to find a route through the crevice separating them from the coast. He started probing the crack's borders with his ice spear, searching for areas where the ice might be strong enough to temporarily sustain their weight or where the opening would be small enough to cross. Tyler collected their most important survival supplies, such as a sleeping bag in case they got stuck overnight, emergency food, and matches. Neither man had anticipated the severity of what they found. A complex network of fractures that reached deep into the ice sheet and displayed indications of ongoing growth. The crack was more than just a straightforward separation in the ice surface. Chunks of ice frequently broke away from the crack's unstable, jagged edges and fell into the Black Sea below. The water level in the fissure was rising and falling rhythmically, which Samuel found even more unsettling. This suggested that their ice island was floating freely and bouncing up and down with wave activity from beneath the lake's surface. Samuel and Tyler had to come to terms with the fact that they would have to spend the night on their floating chunk of ice with little protection and no heat as nightfall drew near and the temperature began to plummet. Using their discarded fishing gear, they made a makeshift windbreak and cuddled in Tyler's sleeping bag, exchanging body heat, and took shifts remaining awake to keep an eye on their circumstances. Throughout the night, the ice underneath them kept shifting and moaning, and they felt their island tip and sway a few times as it reacted to pressure fluctuations and underwater currents. The persistent worry that their ice island would crumble or topple over, plunging them into water so frigid that survival would be measured in minutes rather than hours, characterized the longest night of both men's lives. Samuel kept Tyler composed and concentrated on his survival priorities by applying his expertise and experience. In private, however, he started to question whether they would survive till daylight. He could feel the ice chipping away at the margins of their island during the night, and the noises emanating from it were growing louder. Dawn brought fresh fear and hope. Over the course of the night, the crack that had trapped them grew considerably, reaching a width of over 20 feet. However, fresh ice had also started to develop over the breach as a result of the intense cold. Samuel understood that they might only have a little window of time to cross the thin new ice before their island broke apart entirely, or before it became too fragile to bear their weight. Samuel cautiously examined the new ice formation using methods his grandfather had given him for evaluating dubious ice, concluding that it might be sturdy enough to sustain one person at a time if they moved swiftly and distributed their weight evenly. Samuel would have to leave with the emergency supplies after Tyler, who would have to go first with their necessary equipment. Both men knew they had virtually no chance of surviving in the water, but if one broke through the thin ice, the other would try to save him. Using his ice spear to probe ahead for weak spots and crawling on his belly to disperse his weight, Tyler managed to make the crossing. With their remaining equipment, Samuel followed, feeling the thin ice crack and flex beneath him, but he made it to the other side just as his part started to give way. Behind them, their ice island kept drifting out to sea, carrying with it their costly fishing gear and snowmobiles, which were the source of Samuel's income as an outfitter and guide. By the time they arrived at assistance, both men were exhausted and suffering from frostbite from the 2-day trek back to the closest road through deep snow and freezing temperatures. Both men escaped what should have been a deadly confrontation with the erratic forces that control Alaska's frozen waters. But Tyler needed surgery to preserve many fingers, and Samuel lost 3 toes to frostbite. Both men were permanently reminded of how fast conditions may change in the Alaskan wilderness, and Samuel's career as an ice fishing guide came to an end as a result of the event. The event acted as a wake-up call for the Fairbanks ice fishing community, resulting in enhanced safety procedures and increased awareness of hazardous ice conditions. In order to assist other fishermen avoid the blunders that had almost cost him and Tyler their lives, Samuel spent his recuperation time creating teaching materials and became an advocate for ice safety training. The event reaffirmed to both men the stark fact that Alaska's wilderness follows its own schedule and set of laws. Furthermore, even seasoned outdoor enthusiasts may find themselves vulnerable to forces beyond of their knowledge or control. Music Marcus Johnson had been tracking game through the thick coastal forest since he was old enough to carry a rifle, and like many seasoned hunters who grew up in the isolated villages of southeast Alaska, he had never come across anything in the wilderness that caused him to doubt his knowledge of nature. Hunting deer, bears, and moose in some of the continent's most difficult terrain for 40 years, he had learned to interpret animal signs and find his way through fog-shrouded forests, where visibility was frequently measured in yards rather than miles. The wilderness was not a harsh place to be conquered, but rather a complex ecosystem to be studied and appreciated by hunters like Marcus, who lived off the land and made a living by guiding tourists from the lower 48. Those who have spent significant time in the temperate rainforests of southeast Alaska are aware that even the most seasoned outdoor enthusiasts are put to the test by the combination of hazardous wildlife, dense vegetation, and erratic weather. Over the years, hunters in the Prince of Wales Island area have reported some extremely odd encounters, with seasoned woodsmen claiming to have seen phenomena and animal behavior that defied common sense. There were species and forces in the old forests of southeast Alaska that defied current scientific knowledge, and sometimes even long-standing locals had experiences that made them reevaluate their beliefs about nature. And Marcus was precisely the type of person who brushed such tales aside as the result of exhaustion, bad vision, or too much time spent in solitude in the woods. He was a pragmatic individual who trusted in what he could observe and quantify. Furthermore, he was impatient with stories of enigmatic beings or paranormal experiences. Marcus's reputation for dependability and in-depth familiarity with the local ecology, in my opinion, was a benefit. When wealthy hunters wanted to experience real Alaskan hunting, they called him by name and asked to be guided. The man who was able to locate trophy-winning black bears in areas where previous guides failed to find any. His customers trusted his instincts and his abilities to protect them in situations that would be difficult for younger and more fit hunters. He had been a guide for 30 years, and in that time, he had never lost a customer or had a hunting mishap that could not be explained by ordinary circumstances. Warren Phillips, a prosperous businessman who had been visiting Alaska for more than 15 years, was one of Marcus's frequent clients who hunted with him every fall. Phillips had cultivated the skills and reverence for the outdoors that Marcus required of his hunters. Warren was in his mid-50s, in outstanding physical condition, despite his sedentary work, and had invested much time and money in learning the marksmanship and woodcraft abilities necessary for effective hunting in hard conditions. More significantly, he was aware of and complied with the safety procedures Marcus had established during the course of his decades of leading hunters through some of Alaska's most hazardous terrain. Early in October, when the bears would be actively feeding in anticipation of winter hibernation, and the fall rains had not yet made it too difficult to get through the forest, Marcus and Warren had organized a big black bear hunt. Their goal was to reach a secluded valley on Prince of Wales Island that was only reachable by boat and provided great hunting conditions in an area where other hunters rarely put pressure on them. Finding trophy-sized animals was made easier by the salmon stream that fed the valley and drew many bears during the fall spawning runs. They took Marcus, aluminum skiff, a 24-foot vessel with twin outboard motors that could withstand the choppy waters and high tides of the Inside Passage, to the hunting region. As they made their way through small waterways and around rocky islands that could be dangerous in low visibility, the trip from Ketchikan took the better part of a day, with stops for refueling and weather checks. Clear skies, moderate temperatures, and little breezes were predicted for their 5-day hunt, which would make hunting safe and comfortable. Marcus docked the boat in a safe cove approximately 2 miles from the salmon stream mouth, where they intended to hunt, when they arrived at their location in the late afternoon. There were no indications of human activity in the pure environment. They established a cozy tent on a gravel beach close to the stream mouth, surrounded by thick forests of Sitka spruce and western hemlock that rose from the water's edge to a peak obscured by clouds and mist. Use a portable stove and a sizable military surplus tent to give them with shelter and hot food during their visit. The first 3 hunting days were unremarkable and fruitful. On the second day, Warren caught a magnificent 6-foot boar, and both men saw plenty of black bears grazing along the stream and on salmon carcasses strewn across the riparian zone. A stunning animal with a striking skull and a shiny black coat that would make a wonderful trophy. Marcus was confident that this isolated valley provided some of the best bear hunting in southeast Alaska, and he was happy with the hunt's success and the caliber of the bears they were seeing. However, something that occurred on their fourth night in camp altered Marcus' perception of the woods, which he believed to be very familiar. Working by the light of their camp lanterns as darkness descended on the valley, they had spent the evening processing Warren's bear and getting the hide and skull ready for transportation. Without the usual background hum of small animals moving through the underbrush or the sound of wind in the trees, the night was abnormally quiet in the woods. As they were getting ready to go to bed at midnight, they started to hear movement in the trees surrounding their tent. Initially, it sounded like a big animal, possibly another bear, crashing through the thick undergrowth without trying to move silently. As Marcus listened more intently, however, he became aware that whatever was out there was moving in a manner that was different from any animal he was familiar with. As though something was circling them and assessing their position, the sound seemed to travel in a purposeful manner around their tent. Marcus shook his head and told Warren to stay in their tent and wait to see what happened, but Warren snatched up his rifle and asked if they should go investigate. Marcus had previously been across inquisitive bears around hunting camps, and his usual tactic was to stay out of the way unless the animals acted aggressively or tried to raid their food sources. When they found that there was no easy access to food or other attractants, most bears would inspect a camp for a short time before moving on, but whatever was circling their camp showed no signs of losing interest or moving on to other regions. The noises persisted for more than an hour, during which the creature kept a steady distance of roughly 50 yards from their tent, despite navigating through dense undergrowth that should have been nearly impossible for any huge animal to traverse. The vocalizations Marcus was hearing were even more unsettling because they did not resemble any sounds he had heard from wolves, bears, or other local wildlife. The guttural, deep sounds were oddly articulated, almost like attempts at communication or speaking. The circling ceased at about 2 in the morning, and the silence that followed was even more eerie than the noises had been. With their weapons in hand, Marcus and Warren lay in their sleeping bags, listening for any clue as to the creature's whereabouts or activity. Their own breathing and the distant sound of the salmon stream's water flowing were the only sounds to break the seemingly endless calm. Then they heard footsteps. It was the distinct footsteps of something walking upright on 2 legs, not the noises of an animal moving through the jungle. They appeared to be approaching their tent from the direction of the stream, and their slow, deliberate strides suggested something much heavier and larger than a person. Other hunters and guides had told Marcus about Sasquatch encounters, but he had always written them off as misidentifications of bears or other known species saw under unfavorable circumstances. The footfall persisted for a few minutes, each one bringing them closer to their camp. Marcus heard something big push its way through the thick woodland understory, pushing aside plants and shattering branches. Inhalations became loud, deep, and raspy, suggesting a lung capacity well beyond that of a person. Most horrifying of all, Marcus detected a scent that was a combination of the musky fragrance of a huge predator and the smell of a wet dog. A smell so potent that it pierced their tent's walls. Warren muttered that he was going to check the area outside their tent to see what was coming, but Marcus took hold of his arm and gave him a forceful head shake. It was obvious that whatever was out there was bigger and stronger than either man. Marcus' gut told him that staying hidden and hoping the thing would become disinterested and go on was their greatest chance of surviving. 2 middle-aged guys with hunting rifles would probably have a tough time confronting anything that could go through dense forest like it was open terrain. Outside their tent, the footsteps ceased. Marcus was so close that he could feel the vibrations of the creature's motions through the earth and hear its breathing. There was only the sound of regular, deep breathing and the occasional rustle for a few minutes. Marcus could clearly see that the thing was examining their tent and attempting to ascertain what was inside as it moved around, exhibiting curiosity and intelligence that much above mere animal behavior. The thing then started to circle their tent, keeping a few feet from the walls and moving slowly and cautiously. Marcus and Warren were able to follow its movements by hearing its breathing and footfall, and they became increasingly horrified to learn that they were being inspected by something that had no regard for people or their tools. As it circled, the creature's breathing grew faster and more agitated. indicating arousal or anticipation that caused both men to worry that they were being assessed as possible prey. The thing halted right behind their tent after what seemed like an age and started making new noises that made Marcus shiver. The vocalizations were obviously efforts to replicate human speech, rudimentary word and phrase approximations that indicated the creature had previously observed humans and was trying to communicate in some way. Even though the sounds were warped and unnatural, like hearing human voices filtered through water or played backward, they nevertheless had enough familiar qualities to be extremely unnerving. They were talking about their hunting intentions and their plans for the next day, and the thing sounded like it was mimicking the sounds of Marcus and Warren's voices, which it had heard earlier in the evening. However, the repetitions lacked precision, as though the creature was attempting to comprehend the meaning of the sounds it was imitating and experimenting with various versions. The most unsettling realization for Marcus was that the creature had spent the entire night near their camp, close enough to hear and recall their conversations. As the creature's vocalizations subsided and the sounds of its movement vanished into the thick woodland encircling their camp, dawn eventually arrived. When Marcus and Warren stepped out of their tent, they discovered unmistakable proof that their meeting had been genuine and not a common nightmare triggered by loneliness and stress. Footprints that were obviously humanoid but significantly larger than any human foot were seen on the ground surrounding their tent. These footprints had an arch structure and toes, but they were almost twice as big as Warren's size 11 boots. Other evidence of the creature's existence included claw marks carved into the bark of neighboring trees and broken branches that were 8 to 10 feet high. Most disturbing of all, Marcus discovered proof that the creature had been watching their camp from several different angles during their visit, using a number of locations where the undergrowth had been leveled to provide vantage points that provided unobstructed views of their tent and gear. Despite having 2 days left on their intended excursion, Marcus decided to call it quits on their pursuit and headed back to Ketchikan. The event left both men deeply uneasy, and they no longer felt comfortable resting in the isolated valley where they had been pursued by an unexplainable force. Eager to get to the safety of society and distance themselves from whatever had paid them a visit during the night, they broke camp swiftly and packed their belongings into the skiff. Marcus pushed his boat to its full speed and made only necessary stops for fuel, completing the trip back to Ketchikan in record time. Throughout the journey, neither guy spoke much because they were each preoccupied with their own reflections on what they had seen and how it may affect their comprehension of the Alaskan nature. In order to preserve his reputation as a serious hunter and outdoor enthusiast, Warren instructed Marcus not to share the experience with other customers or guides. Although Marcus consented to keep the meeting confidential, it had a significant impact on how he guided hunters in isolated regions of southeast Alaska. He started making his clients carry more advanced emergency supplies and communication devices. Additionally, he stayed away from camping in places that were too remote for possible rescue or boat access. Most importantly, he created new procedures for handling unidentified wildlife encounters that prioritized client safety over hunting success and avoided conflict. For Warren, the experience put an end to his decades-long Alaskan hunting customs. After returning to his home in the lower 48, he never again went into wilderness places where he would have to deal with animals that were outside the realm of common knowledge. In addition to leaving him with a deep respect for the mysteries that still inhabited Alaska's most distant wilderness places, the event had undermined his faith in his capacity to survive in genuinely remote environments. For years, Marcus and Warren kept the incident a well-guarded secret, shared exclusively with their close relatives and a select group of reliable pals who would take the account seriously enough. Both guys realized that what they had encountered was important and potentially hazardous. However, they also understood that telling such tales in public would probably lead to mockery rather than a thorough examination of the events they had seen. Kenneth Morrison, like many seasoned trappers who lived in the far interior of Alaska, had spent more than 30 years setting trap lines through the harsh winter months and believed he knew every danger the frozen wilderness could pose to anyone who dared to work its trap lines. In addition to navigating through whiteout blizzards that could have confused even seasoned outdoor enthusiasts, he had survived temperatures as low as 60 degrees below zero and dealt with equipment failures that would have killed less experienced trappers who lacked the necessary backup equipment or survival skills to survive when everything went wrong. For trappers like Kenneth, who operated hundreds of miles away from the closest community, winter was more than simply a season. It was a life-or-death situation that distinguished the genuinely skilled from the fortunate. The mix of harsh cold, erratic weather, and long distances makes it possible for a single error or moment of poor judgment to swiftly prove fatal, as anybody who has operated trap lines in inland Alaska knows. Over the years, trappers who worked in the isolated regions surrounding Fairbanks have had some really near calls, with seasoned men going missing or being discovered frozen to death in their huts or along their trap lines weeks later. Trapping was extremely perilous due to the severe environment and isolation that made it profitable, and sometimes, even seasoned trappers overplayed their hand or stumbled into circumstances that tried the bounds of human fortitude. And Kenneth was just the type of trapper who took every safety measure very seriously, keeping extra safety gear on hand and adhering to procedures that had been established over decades of first-hand experience in some of the harshest environments on the planet. Kenneth's father, Donald, had been working trap lines in Alaska since the 1950s and had taught him the technical skills necessary for successful trapping, as well as survival skills that could be the difference between life and death when conditions rapidly deteriorated. I believe this helped Kenneth learn trapping. On several times, Donald had saved Kenneth's life by teaching him to appreciate the cold and to always anticipate that something would go wrong during every trip into the backcountry. He had also prepared backup plans and carried emergency supplies that could seem excessive to outsiders. His collaboration with his younger brother Gary, who assisted in maintaining the vast trap line that spanned more than 200 square miles of isolated wilderness south of Fairbanks, was one element of Kenneth's business that distinguished him from other trappers. Although Gary was 15 years Kenneth's junior, he had been working trap lines since he was a teenager and shared Kenneth's reverence for winter and dedication to safety procedures, which had kept their family safe for decades. Gary oversaw the parts of their trap line that were closer to their base camp and acted as a backup in case of crises, while Kenneth handled the more isolated portions. The brothers collaborated as a team. In late March, when fur prices were at their highest, Kenneth and Gary had scheduled their season's last trapping trip, yet the weather was still frigid enough to maintain the productivity of their trap lines. Their goal was a secluded cabin they had constructed some 80 miles southeast of Fairbanks, in a location that was only reachable by snowmobile in the winter and provided great lynn, wolverine, and other important fur-bearing animal trapping prospects. During long trapping expeditions, the cabin was their base of operations and was equipped with enough food and fuel to keep both men alive for weeks if needed. On a clear morning in late March, with temperatures near -10 degrees Fahrenheit, they left Fairbanks. It's chilly enough to guarantee comfortable travel conditions, but not so cold that wearing the right clothes and equipment makes working outside risky. 10 days were allotted to inspecting and resetting their trap lines, processing any captured animals, and getting their gear ready for storage until the next season. Pulling cargo sleds full of supplies, spare parts, and the specialized gear needed for successful trapping in harsh environments, they traveled on strong Arctic Cat snowmobiles. Typically, it took 4 hours to travel the 80 miles to their isolated cabin, which included steep slopes, frozen marshes, and multiple creek crossings where the ice conditions needed to be carefully assessed before continuing. Gary followed on a smaller snowmobile, but Kenneth led the way on his more potent vehicle. They both used GPS devices and conventional navigation methods to keep on course in wilderness areas where getting lost might be lethal very quickly. Throughout their trip, the weather stayed clear and calm, showing no signs of the storm system that was moving in from the Gulf of Alaska. Even though they had been left alone for weeks, everything seemed to be in order when they reached their cabin in the early afternoon. With a wood-burning stove that could keep the interior cozy, even when the outside temperature plummeted to dangerous levels, the sturdy cabin was constructed from local timbers and was intended to resist the harsh weather conditions of rural Alaska. The rest of their first day was devoted to unloading supplies, inspecting their gear, and organizing their trapping routes for the next few days by Kenneth and Gary. On their second day, Kenneth saw slight changes in the weather that signaled a significant storm system was approaching the area. which was the first sign that their trip would be more difficult than anticipated. High cirrus clouds and rising wind speeds, which experienced outdoor enthusiasts knew were signs of severe weather, were replacing the bright skies and gentle winds of their arrival. Even more worrisome was the sharp decline in atmospheric pressure that Kenneth's barometer was registering, which suggested a strong, low-pressure storm was passing across the area. Kenneth's experience advised Gary that they should think about shortening their vacation and heading back to Fairbanks before the weather worsened more, even though Gary wanted to carry on with their scheduled trapping activities and wait to see how it progressed. He understood how quickly movement may become difficult when visibility dropped to zero, and wind speeds made operating a snowmobile risky or impossible because he had been caught in severe storms during prior trapping expeditions. They would lose out on trapping opportunities and money if they decided to depart early. However, Kenneth realized that no amount of fur was worth putting their life in danger for. But even Kenneth's seasoned weather forecast was taken aback by the storm's intensity before they could carry out their emergency evacuation plans. The snowfall and moderate winds rapidly intensified into a full-fledged blizzard, with winds exceeding 60 miles per hour, according to Kenneth, and snowfall so dense that visibility was limited to less than 10 feet. In just a few hours, the temperature dropped from -10 degrees to -35 degrees, generating wind chill factors that would quickly result in frostbite on exposed flesh. As the storm raged outside, the brothers were forced to seek refuge in their cabin, where they used firewood at a startling rate to keep the interior temperatures warm enough to avoid hypothermia. Using his battery-operated radio, Kenneth kept an eye on the weather and learned that the storm was far more powerful and prolonged than forecasters had anticipated. The snowstorm was supposed to pass across the region in 12 to 18 hours, but it seemed to be stuck over inner Alaska and might stay there for days. They were in a real survival crisis by the fourth day at the cabin, Kenneth understood. Due to the intense cold and persistent wind that drew heat from the cabin, their firewood supply, which should have been sufficient for their 10-day trip, was being used up far more quickly than anticipated. More importantly, they were running low on food because they had intended to kill small wildlife to augment their provisions while trapping. They had to ration the food they had left in the hopes that the weather would improve quickly enough to allow them to return to Fairbanks, as the storm prevented them from engaging in any outdoor activities. The situation became dire on the fifth day, when Kenneth learned that their snowmobiles had developed issues due to the intense cold, which might make it impossible for them to leave even if the weather improved. Kenneth's snowmobile was exhibiting symptoms of fuel line issues that could result in engine failure during the protracted trek back to civilization, while Gary's machine's battery had frozen and fractured. They would be stuck in their isolated cabin with few supplies and no way to call for assistance if they didn't have access to dependable transportation. In order to get at least one of their snowmobiles to work well enough to transport both guys back to Fairbanks, Kenneth had to make the difficult choice to try emergency repairs on them using spare parts and make do with what he had. He worked for hours trying to jury-rig a starting mechanism that didn't rely on the frozen batteries and get around the damaged fuel lines in the icy wind. Gary kept their fire going, rationed their meager food supplies, and helped with the repairs. On the seventh day, Kenneth was able to get his snowmobile operating with makeshift fixes that might allow them to make it to safety, but he wasn't sure the vehicle would make it through the entire 80-mile trip in inclement weather. In addition to burning furniture and other cabin components to maintain their fire when their fuel supply ran out, they were almost completely out of food. Most importantly, even if their snowmobile kept working, both guys were exhibiting early symptoms of fatigue and malnourishment that would make travel even riskier. On the seventh day, the storm eventually started to weaken, with wind speeds decreasing and the snowfall becoming sporadic instead of constant. Kenneth realized that this was their only chance to try to make it back to Fairbanks before their physical state worsened or their makeshift snowmobile repairs failed. They put all of their necessary equipment on Kenneth's machine and left behind the majority of their trapping supplies and equipment, concentrating solely on bringing the necessities in case they got stuck on the way. The journey back to Fairbanks turned into a last-ditch effort to avoid equipment failure and time. Throughout the trip, Kenneth's homemade snowmobile threatened to fully collapse multiple times, forcing them to halt often for further repairs and to take a break when fatigue made it unsafe to continue. Behind Kenneth on the lone snowmobile was Gary. When exhaustion made it hard to focus, the two men took turns driving and shared body heat. Kenneth's makeshift gasoline system eventually broke entirely around halfway back to Fairbanks, leaving them trapped in the woods with no emergency supplies and no means of transportation. The closest community was still over 40 miles away, too far to go given their fragile state in the severe weather. Using components from their wrecked snowmobile and local natural resources, Kenneth turned on his emergency beacon and started building a survival shelter. The subsequent rescue was made more difficult by the distant location where Kenneth and Gary were stranded, as well as the ongoing bad weather. In order to find the brothers and plan a helicopter rescue that might function safely in the mediocre weather, Alaska State Troopers and volunteer search teams worked 2 days on the ground. Both guys were severely dehydrated and hypothermic when rescuers arrived, but they were still aware and able to help with their own evacuation. Gary needed surgery to cure frostbite damage to multiple fingers and toes, while Kenneth spent 3 days in the hospital recuperating from his ordeal. Although both men recovered completely, the experience ruined their trapping careers and gave them a profound respect for how Alaska's winter weather can turn ordinary expeditions into life-or-death survival scenarios. Gary accepted a job that put him near Fairbanks and never again went into the far-off wilderness in the winter, while Kenneth sold his trapping gear and relocated to a warmer area. It reminded the trapping community that the harsh circumstances that define Alaska's winter climate may overwhelm even seasoned outdoor enthusiasts. Kenneth's willingness to forego expensive equipment when survival became the first goal and his thorough emergency preparations were major factors in his survival. The incident served as a reminder of the significance of keeping backup safety gear on hand, keeping conservative safety margins, and identifying when circumstances had gotten so bad that it was no longer safe to continue out scheduled tasks. The event gave both brothers a grim realization of how easily ordinary activities may become deadly when a number of circumstances came together to form the ideal storm. Their capacity to make tough choices under pressure and collaborate well when their lives hinged on cooperation and support from one another were just as important to their survival as their technological know-how and emergency gear. In Alaska's harsh climate, the realization that they had come within hours of freezing to death in their isolated cabin served as a constant reminder of the narrow margin separating disaster from successful wilderness operations. Eddie Patterson had spent years seeking for gold in the isolated rivers and valleys of the interior, just like many others who traveled to Alaska with the hope of becoming wealthy. He had been prospecting in Alaska since the early 1990s, working minor claims and chasing stories of undiscovered placer deposits in locations where the old-timers had given up decades earlier, convinced that the major find was only around the next bend or over the next ridge. In addition to being a site to discover gold, Alaska was a way of life that provided independence from the limitations and problems of contemporary society for prospectors like Eddie, who lived out of their trucks and spent months at a time in the backcountry. Anyone who has spent a significant amount of time prospecting in Alaska is aware that the pursuit of gold is as much about independence and adventure as it is about the possible financial gains. And a lot of prospectors keep working marginal claims even when it's obvious they'll never get rich. Over the years, there had been some extremely odd disappearances among prospectors working the isolated regions surrounding Fairbanks, with seasoned miners going missing from their claims and leaving behind personal belongings, supplies, and equipment that indicated they had no intention of leaving permanently. It was challenging for authorities to ascertain whether missing prospectors had been involved in accidents, chose to relocate, or encountered something more sinister in the wilderness because of the remote location, hazardous working conditions, and secretive nature of many prospecting operations. Eddie, on the other hand, was the type of prospector who preferred to operate alone and only provide details about his operations to a select group of reliable associates who recognized the value of secrecy in the cutthroat business of gold mining. Eddie's reputation as a meticulous and methodical miner who conducted thorough research and attacked every new claim with the deliberate thoroughness that distinguished successful prospectors from weekend hobbyists in my opinion, was helpful. He had a reputation for being able to discern geological formations and spot promising locations that earlier miners had missed. And over the years, his modest enterprises had generated enough gold to support his modest way of life and ongoing prospecting. His expertise was regarded by other miners, who sometimes asked him for guidance on tools, methods, and choosing claims. A fellow prospector named Jerry Townsend, who had been working claims in Alaska for more than 20 years, was one individual who knew Eddie well. They became friends because they both loved mining and had a similar outlook on backcountry living. One of the only people Eddie trusted with specific details about his prospecting endeavors was Jerry, and the two of them frequently exchanged advice about prospective locations and cautioned one another about promises that had not produced results or had exceptional risks. About 100 miles northeast of Fairbanks, Eddie and Jerry had been talking about a remote location that displayed geological features that raised the prospect of large placer deposits that had never been thoroughly investigated using contemporary mining methods. The region was only reachable by tiny plains or lengthy summertime overland trips, and its remoteness had discouraged most prospectors from spending the time and money required for a comprehensive assessment. However, for months, Eddie had been investigating the area, looking at geological surveys and old mining records that indicated the potential of the area had hardly been explored by earlier miners. Late in June, Eddie told Jerry that he was organizing a solitary prospecting expedition to explore a number of promising creeks in the isolated region they had talked about. He intended to spend 3 weeks assessing the ground, collecting samples, and deciding if the region was worth the cost and work of starting a more permanent mining operation. With a dependable 4-wheel drive truck, camping gear certified for Alaskan conditions, and prospecting tools that would enable him to thoroughly and methodically assess any claims, Eddie was well prepared for prolonged backcountry work. Jerry offered to go with Eddie on the excursion, but Eddie insisted on working alone for the first assessments and said he would report back to Fairbanks in mid-July with his results. Both men realized how important it was to have someone who knew where they were and could start a search if something went wrong, so they decided that Jerry would call the police if Eddie didn't return by a certain date. Eddie left copies of his research materials and geological maps, as well as comprehensive information on his anticipated itinerary and areas of activity. Eddie intended to explore a truly remote wilderness area with rocky, heavily forested terrain traversed by countless streams and creeks that displayed the geological traits of gold-bearing gravels. The majority of past mining activity had been concentrated around the main rivers, where transportation and supply issues were easier to handle, although the area had been sparingly prospected during the early gold rush years. Eddie thought that the smaller tributary streams had been neglected for the most part and could have enormous reserves that could be exploited economically using current tools and methods. A group of hunters who were investigating the region 3 weeks later discovered Eddie's truck parked at what looked to be an abandoned campground close to one of the creeks Eddie had intended to explore. The majority of Eddie's personal things, including his wallet, identification, and thorough prospecting records that described his actions throughout the first 2 weeks of his excursion, were in the truck, which had been unlocked. Since his prospecting gear was gone, it is likely that he was working nearby when whatever happened to him happened. As soon as Eddie's abandoned truck was found, Alaska State Troopers organized a search and rescue effort that included volunteers from the prospecting community who were familiar with the area and knew the tools and methods Eddie would have been utilizing. The searchers tracked his recorded actions and discovered evidence of his prospecting efforts at various points throughout the creek system, such as equipment caches, test pits, and sample sites, which suggested he had been systematically assessing the region's gold potential. However, something the searchers discovered a mile upstream from his pickup made the probe far more unsettling. Instead of being dumped or abandoned, Eddie's prospecting gear was strewn across a gravel bar in a pattern that suggested it had been flung around with enormous force. His metal detector was warped and twisted as though it had been crushed by something of extraordinary strength. In contrast, his gold pan and other instruments were strewn all over the place and had damage that was beyond the realm of normal use or unintentional dropping. The evidence of a battle, evident in the gravel and soft sand of the creek side, was more worrisome. With deep gouges in the ground and debris all over the place, the area appeared to have been violently disturbed, as if Eddie had been facing something far bigger and more powerful than a person. The searchers discovered big tracks pushed into the mud close to the creek, which was the most unsettling of all. Clearly humanoid footprints, but far bigger than anything Eddie or any other person could have created. Although the footprints were almost 18 inches long and had the appearance of toes and a foot-like arch, their size and depth suggested that the object was much heavier than a human. Something at least 8 or 9 feet tall was inferred by the stride length between tracks, and a weight of several hundred pounds was suggested by the depth of the impressions in the soft ground. Most disturbing of all, despite the humanoid foot structure, the footprints revealed claw marks at the tips of what should have been toes, indicating something that was not completely human. When Jerry joined the hunt, he was able to give investigators more information about Eddie's tactics and probable patterns of conduct. Jerry thought that Eddie had been methodically moving upstream, checking gravel deposits and observing geological markers that indicated the existence of gold-bearing deposits, based on his understanding of his prospecting methods. Whatever happened to him must have happened while he was working in that particular area, because the spot where his equipment was discovered, strewn about, was the furthest point of his recorded progress. Teams of volunteers and paid searchers combed every valley, creek, and ridge within miles of where Eddie's equipment had been located during the 2-week-long hunt for him. Hundreds of square miles of wilderness were overflew by aircraft in search of any trace of Eddie or any information that could help explain his disappearance. Several tracking dogs refused to follow specific tracks or shown signs of great agitation while approaching specific sites, according to the handlers who brought the dogs in to follow scent trails. Several searchers had odd experiences during the lengthy search, which raised the possibility that there was something out of the ordinary in the location where Eddie had vanished. In addition to vocalizations that sounded nearly human but were distorted and magnified beyond anything that could have emanated from a human, other teams reported hearing sounds that did not correspond to any known species. Miles distant from the original scene, and seemed much more recent, were other big tracks that resembled the ones found near Eddie's dispersed equipment, according to one crew. When no more evidence was discovered and resources were required for other problems, the official search was eventually canceled, but Jerry and a few other prospectors kept up their covert hunt for months. Their research revealed further unsettling evidence, such as additional sites where the gigantic humanoid footsteps were discovered, and places where flora had been damaged in ways that indicated the passing of a creature far more powerful and massive than any known natural species. With animal remains strewn in patterns that suggested consumption by something with immense strength and distinct feeding habits from any known predator, some of these sites displayed indications of what looked to be feeding activity. When discreetly questioned about the disappearance of the strange evidence discovered, local native Alaskan elders nodded knowingly and related old tales of creatures they called the Torners, massive half-animal, half-human creatures that lived in the deepest wilderness regions and protected ancient lands from human encroachment. Their customs state that these animals were fiercely protective of their territory and would attack anyone who strayed too far or disrupted their sacred sites. According to the elders, Eddie might have inadvertently crossed an old boundary or tampered with a location that was guarded by these mythical guardians. Although hunters and other prospectors have occasionally reported seeing big humanoid tracks or hearing weird vocalizations in distant areas of interior Alaska, no further proof has been discovered, and the inquiry into Eddie's disappearance is still officially open. Jerry claimed that he no longer felt secure working alone in the isolated places where he had spent the majority of his adult life, so he eventually quit prospecting and relocated to a smaller community nearer Anchorage. Several miners reported leaving promising claims in locations where they had discovered the enormous tracks or saw unexplained phenomena, while other prospectors discreetly started working in groups or pairs instead of going into the backcountry alone. Eddie's disappearance was a sobering reminder to Jerry and the other prospectors who knew him that the wilderness of Alaska still had secrets and threats that were outside the realm of common knowledge. The evidence discovered at the scene of his disappearance pointed to an interaction with something that the indigenous peoples who had inhabited Alaska for thousands of years were familiar with, but that science had not yet documented. Anyone who worked alone in the isolated places where gold may be found was constantly concerned about the possibility that seasoned prospectors could just disappear, leaving behind only enormous tracks and strewn about equipment. However, there were also other, riskier riches concealed. The unofficial legend of Alaska's prospecting community included Eddie's disappearance. A warning about the dangers of working alone in places that might be guarded by people who don't want others to enter. The evidence indicated that he had come across something in the wilderness that was far more dangerous than bears, wolves, or any other known threat that prospectors typically prepared for when they ventured into Alaska's remote interior in search of adventure and gold. But his fate was still unknown. Victoria Chen had climbed peaks all over the world and believed she understood the hazards and dangers associated with high-altitude excursions in harsh weather, much like many seasoned mountaineers who traveled to Alaska in search of the ultimate climbing difficulties. She had years of experience navigating altitude sickness, erratic weather, and technical climbing issues that may kill the unprepared or unfortunate. She had climbed in the European Alps, the Andes, and the Himalayas. Climbers like Victoria, who earned their living by leading expeditions and writing about mountaineering experiences, saw Alaska as the last frontier, where harsh weather, isolated locations, and difficult terrain put even the most seasoned alpine athletes to the test. The mountains in the Alaska Range are not only tall, but also actively hostile, with weather patterns that may quickly transform from ideal climbing conditions to dangerous storms, as anyone who has tried serious climbing in the area knows. Over the years, climbing expeditions in the isolated regions surrounding Denali have had some very close calls, with seasoned mountaineers going missing in creases, becoming trapped in avalanches, or just plain going missing during storms that prevented search and rescue efforts for days or weeks. Mountaineering in Alaska was one of the riskiest activities on the planet because of the combination of high elevation, severe weather, and great distances from assistance. Even seasoned climbers sometimes overplayed their hand or stumbled into situations that were too dangerous for them to endure. Victoria was the type of climber who took every safety measure very seriously, carrying extra gear and according to procedures that had been established over decades of first-hand experience on some of the most difficult peaks in the world. Jonathan Hayes, a great climber who had been leading trips in Alaska since the 1980s and had survived more near misses and hazardous situations than any other guide working the Alaska Range, taught Victoria mountaineering, which I believe helped. In addition to the technical know-how needed for successful high-altitude climbing, Jonathan had imparted the risk-taking and decision-making skills that may be the difference between life and death in situations where things quickly deteriorated. Victoria appreciated this traditional method and blended it with contemporary tools and communication systems to develop a methodical approach to expedition planning that has protected her customers throughout numerous difficult climaxes. A younger climber called Thomas Riley, who had relocated from Colorado to Alaska in order to take on the state's mountains, severe conditions, and technical challenges, was a frequent climbing companion who accompanied Victoria on her most daring missions. Despite having a great deal of expertise mountaineering in frigid climates and being in his early 30s, Thomas lacked the precise understanding of Alaskan conditions and weather patterns that could have made the difference between a successful ascent and a deadly catastrophe. For 2 years, Victoria had been Thomas's mentor, progressively exposing him to increasingly difficult routes and farther-flung destinations as his abilities and expertise grew. On an unidentified mountain in a remote area of the Alaska Range, Victoria and Thomas had been preparing a bold assault. Due to the mix of difficult terrain, unpredictable weather, and severe isolation from prospective rescue efforts, this technically challenging climb had only been attempted twice previously and had never been successfully completed. The peak reached above 14,000 feet and demanded extreme technical climbing abilities and the capacity to survive in circumstances that frequently plummeted to 40 below zero. Climbers called the mountain Devil's Ridge because of its knife-edge summit approach and reputation for taking lives. They scheduled their expedition for late April, when the weather was generally more steady than it would be during the winter, but there was still enough snow to allow for safe passage across the mountain's glaciated approaches. It would take them 2 weeks to hike and ski through isolated wilderness to get to the mountain's base, and then another week of technical climbing to reach the top and go back to their base camp. In case the weather prevented them from returning on their scheduled time, they had adequate food and gasoline for a month. 10 days of challenging travel were needed to reach the base of Devil's Ridge, traversing terrain that included steep mountain passes, creased glaciers, and places where avalanche threat necessitated careful route selection and timing. Pulling cargo sleds filled with climbing gear, camping supplies, and the specialist cold weather gear required for high-altitude survival in Arctic conditions, Victoria and Thomas traveled on cross-country skis. They made good progress toward their goal because of the comparatively consistent weather during their approach, which was clear but cold. Victoria was happy with their progress and the state of both climbers when they arrived at their intended base camp at the base of Devil's Ridge. Following the difficult approach, Thomas handled the travel well and shown no symptoms of the altitude-related issues or exhaustion that occasionally plagued climbers who were not yet completely acclimated to the circumstances they would encounter on the peak. Their food and fuel supplies were sufficient for their intended climbing timetable with comfortable safety margins, and their equipment was operating as intended. As they set up camps and fixed ropes on the trickiest parts of their route, Victoria and Thomas made steady progress up the lower slopes of Devil's Ridge over the first 3 days of climbing, which proceeded as planned. With multiple pitches of nearly vertical ice climbing and rock parts requiring strong technical skills, the mountain lived up to its reputation as a challenging destination. However, both climbers were doing well, and the weather held steady enough to permit safe ascent. However, Victoria became increasingly worried about their safety after seeing minor changes in the weather on their 4th day on the mountain. Increased wind speeds and the type of high, thin clouds that experienced Alaskan climbers knew were signs of major storms were replacing the clear, frigid weather they had experienced throughout their approach and early climbing. Even more concerning was the fact that Victoria's air pressure was changing quickly, a sign that a strong weather storm was on its way. Thomas argued that they had spent too much time and energy on the excursion to turn back when they were within striking distance of their goal, and wanted to keep ascending in an attempt to reach the summit before conditions worsened. However, Victoria's experience advised her to descend right away and set up a safe base camp location so they could wait out any impending storms. She was aware of how rapidly conditions may become life-threatening at high altitude because she had been caught in strong storms on prior Alaskan missions. Victoria's worries were justified when the weather system struck Devil's Ridge with more ferocity than even her seasoned evaluation of the warning indicators they had seen. Moderate winds and light snow rapidly intensified into a full-fledged Arctic storm, with Victoria estimating wind speeds of over 80 miles per hour and snowfall so severe that visibility was lowered to less than 5 feet. In just a few hours, the temperature dropped from -10 degrees to -40 degrees, producing wind chill conditions that would quickly result in frostbite on exposed skin. About halfway up the mountain, the climbers were forced to seek emergency cover in a hurriedly built snow cave on a tiny ledge, where they hid in their sleeping bags while the storm raged outside. Victoria communicated with their base camp and kept an eye on the weather using her avalanche beacon. However, radio communication was sporadic and challenging due to the harsh environment. More importantly, they were at risk from avalanches and rockfall caused by the strong winds that were occurring all around them because of their location on the bare mountain face. Victoria became aware that they were in a true survival situation by the time they were stranded in the snow cave on the 2nd day. Their location on the mountain was getting more perilous as wind-driven snow started to obstruct their shelter and threatened to bury them alive, and the storm showed no indications of abating. As they battled to keep their bodies warm in the bitter cold and roaring wind, they found that their fuel supplies, which had been estimated for typical climbing conditions, were being used up far more quickly than anticipated. More importantly, Victoria was starting to worry that Thomas might not be able to make the risky descent that would be necessary to get to safety because he was starting to exhibit symptoms of hypothermia and altitude sickness. The combination of thin air, intense cold, and the stress of their survival predicament was causing his brain to become impacted, as evidenced by his slurred and confused speech, poor judgment, and erratic behavior. Victoria recognized that she could need to try a rescue descent while caring for a partner who was losing the ability to follow safety procedures or make logical decisions. As the situation worsened on their third day in the snow cave, Victoria tried to warm Thomas and administer emergency medical care with their little first aid supplies, but she was unable to wake him up. Victoria knew that he was in the last stages of hypothermia and would pass away in a matter of hours unless she could find a way to transport him to a lower altitude and warmer surroundings as his breathing became shallow and erratic. Despite the ongoing storm and the great danger of moving on the mountain in such conditions, Victoria decided in desperation to try an emergency descent with Thomas. She built a device that would enable her to rappel herself while lowering Thomas down the mountain, using methods she had learnt during rescue training. But even in ideal circumstances, the procedure would be extremely risky and physically taxing. The attempt almost amounted to suicide in the midst of a violent storm with almost no visibility and life-threatening wind gusts. As Victoria struggled to keep Thomas alive while negotiating treacherous terrain rendered even more hazardous by the storm, the descent turned into a terrifying struggle against the weather and time. Avalanches caused by the wind and fresh snowfall swept across their path multiple times during the descent, forcing Victoria to seek cover and wait for the situation to calm down before continuing. Under normal circumstances, the procedure would have taken a few hours, but it took a full day of life-or-death conflict. After 18 hours of non-stop work, Victoria eventually arrived at their base camp, with Thomas hardly awake and suffering from severe frostbite on his hands and feet. She quickly turned on their emergency beacon and started using their camp supplies to administer what little medical attention she could. However, it was evident that Thomas needed to be taken to a hospital right away in order to survive. Since the storm was still strong and helicopter rescue was not feasible, Victoria had to keep caring for Thomas in the hopes that things would get better enough to permit rescue efforts. Rescue coordinators in Anchorage heard the emergency beacon signal, but they were unable to respond right away due to the terrible weather. Despite her own fatigue and frostbite injuries from the terrifying descent, Victoria spent 2 more days giving Thomas emergency medical attention. By utilizing their emergency food supplies to stay strong during the hardship, exchanging body heat, and rationing their remaining fuel to give warmth, she was able to keep Thomas alive. On the 6th day, when the storm eventually broke, a helicopter rescue crew managed to get to their base camp and transport the 2 climbers to an Anchorage hospital. Victoria received treatment for fatigue, dehydration, and milder cold injuries, but Thomas needed surgery to preserve multiple fingers and toes that had been badly frostbitten throughout their journey. Although both climbers recovered fully, the incident put a stop to Thomas's mountaineering career and left Victoria with a deep appreciation for how Alaskan weather can turn ordinary climbs into life-threatening situations. Victoria's actions during the descent and subsequent care of her injured partner were cited as examples of how appropriate training and equipment could make the difference between life and death in extreme conditions, turning the rescue operation into a case study in emergency procedures and survival techniques. Despite the danger, her choice to descend in the midst of the storm was eventually credited with saving Thomas's life by bringing him down before his condition worsened beyond repair. According to Victoria, the experience reaffirmed the grim fact that even the most seasoned climbers may find themselves at the whim of weather systems that were beyond human control and preparation, and that Alaska's mountains functioned on their own schedule and rules. Her experience on Devil's Ridge served as a reminder that mountaineering in Alaska required not only physical fitness and technical proficiency, but also the discernment to know when conditions had gotten so bad that it was no longer safe to continue climbing. Victoria became an advocate for improved weather monitoring and evacuation planning for climbers attempting difficult routes in extreme conditions, and the incident resulted in improvements to emergency communication equipment and rescue protocols for expeditions operating in remote areas of the Alaska Range. For other mountaineers who were lured to Alaska's peaks by its reputation as the ultimate test of climbing and survival capabilities, her survival tale served as both motivation and caution. Music Christopher Vaughn had been riding the backcountry and remote trails around Fairbanks for more than 15 years, and like many seasoned snowmoilers who grew up exploring Alaska's vast winter wilderness, he believed he knew every danger the frozen landscape could pose to anyone venturing far from civilization during the long Alaskan winter. He had lived through blizzards when there was no more light, handled mechanical failures and temperatures that could kill an inexperienced person in a matter of hours, and traversed perilous river crossings where thin ice could crash a snowmobile and rider into lethal water. For snowmoilers like Christopher, who relied on their machines to carry them to far-flung cottages and construction sites, in addition to using them for leisure. Longtime Alaskans and visitors who misjudged the difficulties of traversing hundreds of miles of icy tundra were distinguished by the essential talent of winter riding. Extreme cold, erratic weather, and great distances from assistance make it possible for even small errors or equipment malfunctions to quickly escalate into life-threatening situations, as anybody who has spent significant time snowmoiling in inland Alaska knows. Over the years, there have been some really unsettling disappearances among snowmoers who work in the isolated regions surrounding Fairbanks. Skilled riders have gone missing on routes they have safely traversed dozens of times. Search teams had a hard time figuring out what had happened to missing riders or where their remains may be because of the severe winter weather and scavenging animals, which soon wiped out most signs of accidents or mechanical breakdowns. Christopher was the type of snowmoiler who took every safety measure very seriously. He carried emergency survival equipment and adhered to safety procedures that had been established over decades of first-hand experience in some of the harshest winters on the planet. Christopher's uncle Raymond, who had been riding in Alaska since the 1970s and had survived more near misses and hazardous situations than any other rider in the Fairbanks area, taught him snowmoiling, which I believe was helpful. In addition to the technical know-how needed for safe winter travel, Raymond had imparted the risk-taking and decision-making skills that could be the difference between life and death in situations where equipment malfunctioned in isolated areas or weather rapidly deteriorated. In order to develop a methodical strategy to wilderness travel that has kept him safe throughout hundreds of solo rides, Christopher embraced this traditional method and integrated it with contemporary GPS and communication devices. Jake Martinez, a fellow snowmoiler who had relocated to Alaska from Montana and was keen to master the specific skills necessary for safe travel in the harsh circumstances of the far north, was one frequent riding partner who occasionally joined Christopher on his longer adventures. Although Jake was physically fit, in his late 20s, and had a lot of expertise with winter sports and cold weather survival, he lacked the understanding of Alaskan winter conditions that may make the difference between a successful ride and a fatal accident. For several months, Christopher had been Jake's coach, progressively exposing him to increasingly difficult routes and farther-flung locations as his abilities and self-assurance grew. In order to check on a remote hunting cabin that he used during the fall hunting season and that needed winter upkeep to prevent damage from the harsh cold and large snow loads that characterized interior Alaska winters, Christopher had been organizing a solitary snowmobile expedition. About 120 miles northeast of Fairbanks, the cabin was only reachable by snowmobile in the winter and required a full day of riding across difficult terrain that included high mountain passes, frozen rivers, and places where choosing a safe route was crucial due to avalanche threat. Jake had requested to go with Christopher on the maintenance trip, but Christopher preferred to ride by himself when inspecting his remote property. Christopher agreed to take Jake on a leisurely ride to the same location later in the winter, when they would have more time to address any issues that might arise. In order to give Jake a basic communication schedule that would enable him to notify authorities in the event that Christopher did not check in as scheduled, they decided that Christopher would call Jake by satellite phone both when he arrived at the cabin and again when he started his journey back to Fairbanks. On a beautiful Friday morning in early February, with temperatures hovering about -20 degrees Fahrenheit, Christopher left Fairbanks. Chilly enough to guarantee good trail conditions, but not so cold as to cause hazardous wind chill effects or severe cold-related equipment issues. He intended to work on maintenance at his isolated cabin over the weekend and return to Fairbanks on Monday night, when there would still be daylight to make the lengthy drive without incident. In addition to emergency survival gear, he brought tools, spare parts, and supplies for cabin maintenance, as well as enough food and fuel for a week in case the weather prevented him from making his scheduled return. Typically, the journey to Christopher's isolated cabin took roughly 6 hours, traversing terrain he was familiar with from years of hunting and maintenance visits. The route featured a number of difficult portions that required close attention to weather and snow conditions due to steep climbs and river crossings. However, Christopher had made the trip numerous times without experiencing any significant issues. He had spent a significant amount of money on additions and upgrades that increased the snowmobile's dependability and performance in harsh environments. His snowmobile was a strong Arctic cat built for long-distance backcountry travel. On Friday night, Christopher made his first planned check-in call on time, stating that he had arrived at his cabin without incident and that, despite the severe winter conditions, it was in fine shape. Although the snow loads on the roof were larger than anticipated and would take more effort to properly remove, he anticipated finishing all required maintenance over the weekend and starting his return trip on Monday morning as scheduled. There was no sign of any issues or worries regarding the equipment's operation or the weather during the quick and regular call. Jake wasn't immediately worried when Christopher didn't show up for his planned check-in call on Monday night, since satellite phone service might not be dependable in the isolated mountainous region where the cabin was situated. There was no cell phone service in the region, and even when equipment was working correctly, satellite coverage could be obstructed by weather or topographical factors, making communication impossible. Jake waited until Tuesday night before reporting Christopher as missing and passed due to Alaska State Troopers. By Alaskan standards, the ensuing search and rescue effort was enormous, involving ground teams with tracking dogs, helicopter overflights, and communication with other snowmoilers who were familiar with the area and could have provided information about the routes Christopher was most likely to have taken. However, the size of Alaska's interior and the harshness of the winter made searching very challenging. A single snowmobile and rider might easily stay concealed behind snowdrifts or in places that search planes couldn't reach, so the teams had to scour hundreds of square miles of wilderness. About 40 miles from Christopher's cabin, in a secluded valley, a helicopter crew saw something strange on the 4th day of the search. The debris was strewn across a large area, and there was no evidence of the rider who had been operating the snowmobile, which looked to have been engaged in a terrible accident. After landing, the searchers started looking through the wreckage in an attempt to uncover information about what had happened and where Christopher may be. What they discovered was quite unsettling. Although Christopher's snowmobile was entirely wrecked, the damage was not consistent with any kind of collision that searchers had previously encountered. As though it had been subjected to forces far greater than any impact with the earth, the hefty steel frame was bent and twisted. Smaller parts were strewn throughout an area that stretched for hundreds of yards in all directions, and the engine had been ripped from its mounts and flung more than 50 feet from the main wreckage. The fact that Christopher was nowhere to be found at the accident site was the most disturbing of all. Skilled search and rescue workers were aware that snowmobile crashes usually left riders stuck beneath the debris or thrown clear at the initial impact, leaving them in a very small space surrounding their immobilized machines. However, no sign of Christopher was discovered despite a thorough search of the neighborhood using metal detectors and tracking dogs. At the crash site, the investigators also found evidence that was difficult to explain. Massive footprints in the snow surrounding the wreckage were unlike any traces produced by local creatures. The imprints were massive, easily 3 times the size of the biggest bear tracks, and their stride length indicated that the animal was larger and stronger than any Alaskan native. With distinct toe impressions and an arch structure that suggested a humanoid creature of extraordinary size and strength, some of the tracks looked to be from bare feet rather than paws. The claw marks discovered on trees all across the crash scene were even more unsettling. Something with claws longer and sharper than any known predator made the gouges in the bark, and it reached heights well out of reach of wolves, bears, and any other species that might be in the region. The fact that some of the claw marks seemed new indicated that whatever had created them had recently been at the location, perhaps at the time of Christopher's accident. In an effort to find any sign of the missing snowmoiler, crews extended their coverage area and used more advanced detection technology during the 2 weeks that followed Christopher's disappearance. In order to find evidence that had been overlooked during ground searches or heat signatures that would point to a person in trouble, aircraft fitted with thermal imaging cameras flew grid patterns across hundreds of square miles. To find out where Christopher was or what had happened to him, metal detectors were employed to look for his wallet, keys, and other personal belongings. Throughout the lengthy search effort, a number of search team members shared experiences that indicated there might be something out of the ordinary in the vicinity where Christopher vanished. Vocalizations that sounded almost human, but were distorted and magnified beyond anything that could have come from a human, were among the sounds that several teams heard that did not correspond to any known species. At a distance, one search crew claimed to have spotted a huge person moving through the trees, but upon closer inspection, they simply uncovered more of the giant tracks that had been recovered at the crash site. When discreetly questioned about the disappearance and the peculiar evidence discovered, local Alaskan elders mentioned old stories about monsters that lived in the most remote wilderness and protected areas that were off-limits to mankind. These creatures were extremely strong, according to their traditional tales, and would attack anyone who crossed holy lines or tampered with locations that were guarded by spiritual energies. According to the elders, Christopher may have inadvertently ventured into a prohibited area and come across guards who were considerably more dangerous than any predatory species. When no more evidence was discovered and resources were required for other emergencies, the official search for Christopher was eventually halted. However, Jake and a few other snowmoilers carried on with their private hunt for months. Their research revealed further unsettling evidence, such as additional sites where the enormous tracks were discovered and patches of disturbed forest that indicated the passage of something far more strong and vast than any known natural species. Eventually, Jake left Alaska, saying that after Christopher's abduction, the isolated places where he had enjoyed snowmobiling no longer felt secure, and the peculiar evidence that had been found throughout the search. Several riders indicated that they had abandoned planned expeditions when they came across the enormous tracks or heard the strange vocalizations that search teams had described. And other snowmoilers discreetly started to avoid the area where Christopher had disappeared. Christopher's disappearance was a sobering reminder to Jake and the other snowmoilers who had known him that there were still secrets and perils in Alaska's wilderness that were beyond the realm of common knowledge. The evidence discovered at the accident site indicated that Christopher had come across something that the indigenous peoples who had inhabited Alaska for thousands of years were familiar with, but that science had not yet documented. Anyone who rode alone in the isolated places where such encounters can take place would always worry about the possibility that expert riders could just disappear, leaving behind only mangled gear and enormous trails. Although Christopher's fate is still unknown, the evidence points to forces he faced in the wilderness that were far more dangerous than the weather emergencies, mechanical malfunctions, or wildlife encounters snowmoilers typically prepared for when traveling into the far interior of Alaska. His disappearance was incorporated into the unofficial folklore of the snowmobiling community in Alaska. A warning on the dangers of going alone in places where ancient guardians may still be patrolling borders that are not visible on modern maps, or that GPS equipment cannot navigate. When Christopher's snowmobile's mangled wreckage was finally found and brought to Fairbanks, mechanics and accident investigators looked at it, but they were unable to determine what kind of pressures had been needed to fully ruin the machine. Unknown mechanical failure was listed as the accident's official cause, but anyone who had seen the evidence firsthand knew that no mechanical issue could explain the devastation discovered in that isolated valley where Christopher Vaughn had come across something that defied logic.